The storm came in from the north without much warning, the way the worst things always do. Evelyn had been watching it build for the better part of an hour through the stagecoach window. A gray-green wall of cloud pressing down over the mountain range like a hand flattening dough. But she had told herself it would hold. She had told herself a lot of things over the past 3 weeks, most of them untrue, and she was getting tired of her own optimism. She was 26 years old, alone, and traveling to marry a man she had exchanged exactly 11 letters with. His name was Harold Fenwick. He owned a cattle operation outside a town called Clearwater, and his last letter had described himself as a man of steady habits and fair dealing. She had read that sentence 4 times before deciding it was good enough. At 26, having buried her mother in October and watched the family's savings dissolve into funeral costs and a landlord's back payments, steady habits and fair dealing sounded like paradise. The other 2 passengers in the coach were a traveling merchant named Aldous Poole, who smelled of pipe tobacco and kept falling asleep against the window, and a younger woman, maybe 19, who had introduced herself as Clara and then said almost nothing for 2 days. Clara was traveling to meet her sister in a settlement called Pine Fork. She had her hands folded in her lap the entire ride, like she was waiting for something bad. She had good instincts. The driver, a lean, weather-creased man named Jessup, who Evelyn had pegged on sight as the type who made good time by ignoring problems until they became emergencies, pulled the coach to a hard stop just past midday. The vehicle lurched, and Aldous Poole woke with a grunt. Evelyn grabbed the window frame to keep from sliding off the seat. Jessup appeared at the coach door a moment later. His hat was already dusted white. "There's a situation," he said. "What kind of situation?" Evelyn asked. "The kind where I've got to decide whether to push on through Red Fork Pass or pull up before it closes." He squinted at the sky. Pass closes, we're stuck in the open. No shelter, no wood. "And if we pull up?" "There's a settlement about a mile east, Bloodstone Valley. We waited out there." "How long?" Jessup turned and looked at the mountains. His jaw moved like he was chewing something. "Could be 2 days. Could be 2 weeks. Storm like this gets into the passes. It doesn't hurry." Aldous Poole leaned forward. "I have merchandise in Clearwater, a schedule." "Your schedule don't mean much if you freeze to death in the pass, friend." Clara said nothing. She was looking out the opposite window at the white nothing swallowing the road behind them. They went east. Bloodstone Valley announced itself with a wooden sign nailed to a dead pine tree, the lettering burned in uneven strokes. Bloodstone Valley, population 312. Someone had crossed out the number and written 289 beneath it. Below that, in different handwriting, "You are welcome here." Below that, in different handwriting still, "Don't start trouble." It was not a reassuring arrival. The settlement was larger than Evelyn had expected. 2 main streets crossing each other at a muddy intersection, a row of buildings on each side, most of them functional rather than finished. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith operation that looked closed, a boarding house with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Halloran's, rooms and meals. At the far end of the main street, a squat, stone building with bars on the windows that might have been a jail or might have been something else. Hard to tell. The snow was already coming down in earnest by the time Jessup helped them down from the coach. He carried their bags to the boarding house door without ceremony. "When are you leaving?" Evelyn asked him. "When it breaks." He handed her the carpet bag. The latch had given out somewhere in the mountains. He'd tied it shut with a length of rope. "Could be a few days." "And if I need to reach Clearwater?" Jessup looked at her with an expression she would come to recognize in Bloodstone Valley. Not unkind exactly, but finished, like he'd already moved past this part of the conversation in his head. "Ma'am, right now Clearwater might as well be the moon." He went to put the horses up, and Evelyn stood in the falling snow with her bag and $43, and the growing understanding that her carefully arranged future had just slipped its leash. Margaret Halloran was a woman in her late 50s who moved like she'd learned efficiency the hard way. Every motion deliberate and economical, nothing wasted. She was not warm when they came in, but she was fair, which Evelyn would later understand was more valuable. She gave them each a room, $3 a week, meals included, collected payment without comment, and showed them up a narrow staircase that complained at every step. Evelyn's room was small and cold. The window looked out on the side street, where a boy of about 12 was shoveling snow away from a doorway with the grim focus of someone who had done it too many times to find it interesting. The bed had a wool blanket and a second-hand quilt. The washstand had a pitcher and a crack in the basin that had been repaired with some kind of dark compound. She sat on the edge of the bed and did arithmetic. $3 a week for the room. Food included, so that was manageable. But she didn't know how long the storm would last, and Jessup had said 2 weeks in a tone that suggested he believed it. That was $6 minimum. She had 43, which left 37, which would not get her to Clearwater on another stage, pay whatever additional fees were involved, and arrive looking like a woman a man might want to marry rather than a woman he'd feel obligated to take in out of pity. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and held them there. Harold Fenwick was expecting her. She had sent a letter from the last town, Millhaven, saying she would arrive within the week. He didn't have her route. If she didn't come, he might assume she'd changed her mind. He might write to the agency. The agency might... She stopped herself. She couldn't fix what hadn't happened yet. What she could do was find out what Bloodstone Valley had that might be worth anything to her. She went back downstairs. Margaret Halloran was in the kitchen, which was also her office, which was also apparently where she kept her accounts. There was a ledger open on the table beside the stove, and she was writing in it with the focused unhappiness of someone who already knew what the numbers were going to say. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said from the doorway. Margaret didn't look up. "You're going to anyway. Is there work in this town? Anything I could do for wages while I'm stuck here?" Now Margaret looked up. She studied Evelyn the way a person studies a horse they're considering buying. Not unkind, but clinical. "What can you do?" "I can keep books. I was a bookkeeper for 3 years at a dry goods company in Illinois. I can write. I can calculate. I can organize financial records." She paused. "I can cook adequately. I can sew. I'm not particularly gifted with animals." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Bookkeeping. Yes. Can you tell me what's wrong with mine?" It was a test. Evelyn knew it. She came to the table, turned the ledger around, and spent 2 minutes reading. The entries were not wrong exactly. Margaret Halloran knew her own business, but they were kept in a way that made the real picture harder to see. Expenses mixed with receivables. Weekly tallies that didn't distinguish between room fees and meal fees. A column for miscellaneous that had absorbed too many things it shouldn't have. "Your occupancy rate is masking how thin your food margin is," Evelyn said. "You're probably running close to break even on meals, possibly at a loss, but the room fees are obscuring it because the totals look fine." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, $1 a week, plus your room and meals, if you reorganize the books and help in the mornings. It wasn't charity. Evelyn understood that. It was a transaction between two practical women, and she felt something in her chest release slightly. Not relief, not quite, but the working edge of it. "Done," she said. Well, the storm settled in like it planned to stay. By the third day, the snow was past the bottom of the first-floor windows, and the sky was the color of dirty wool, and Jessup's stagecoach sat buried in the stable yard like a prehistoric thing waiting to be excavated. Clara, the young woman who'd shared the coach, spent most of her time in her room. Aldous Poole, who had apparently decided that waiting out the storm in the saloon was preferable to waiting it out sober, could be heard most evenings through the thin walls of the boarding house, singing something that might once have been a song. Evelyn worked. She reorganized Margaret's ledgers in 3 days, built a clean tracking system for the next quarter, and then, because she was thorough, and because she was also trying to avoid thinking about Harold Fenwick, she went back through the previous year's accounts looking for patterns. What she found was not what she expected. "Your income drops every March," she said to Margaret one evening. They had fallen into a habit of talking over the accounts after supper when the other boarders were settled. "Winter does that. Not just March, every March specifically. And here," Evelyn pointed to a column, "your coal costs went up in March of last year by almost 30%, but your room rates didn't change. You absorbed the increase yourself." Coal company raised its prices. "Which coal company?" Margaret's expression shifted slightly. "Not much, but enough." "Consolidated Rock and Mineral," she said, with a flatness that was itself a kind of information. "They run the mines north of here. They also supply coal to most of the valley. They supply coal and they run the mines? They supply just about everything. Coal, timber, transport. Consolidated supplies it, and they set the price. She said it the way you say something you've said too many times, something that stopped surprising you long ago. Halloran's has been in my family for 20 years. When Consolidated came in, 8 years back now, prices went up and they've been going up since. Not enough to make you close, just enough to make sure you never get ahead. Evelyn looked at the ledger. Then she looked at Margaret. That's deliberate, she said. I know. That's a deliberate strategy. Keep the local businesses just viable enough that they can't leave and can't fight back, but never let them build capital. I know what it is, Margaret said quietly. Knowing what it is doesn't mean you can do anything about it. She closed the ledger and went to bed, and Evelyn sat alone at the table with the numbers in front of her and the particular cold anger of someone who has just understood exactly how a trap works. She met Gideon Cross on a Wednesday, 9 days into the storm, when he came to the boarding house to ask Margaret if she had room for one more. He was not what she expected of a rancher. She'd imagined, in some vague, composite way, men like Harold Fenwick's letters, steady, unremarkable, defined by their acreage. Gideon Cross was tall and dark-haired and moved through spaces like he was calculating the exits, which she would later understand was not a metaphor. His coat was worn at both elbows. He had a cut above his left eye that was maybe a week old, faded to yellow at the edges. His hands, when he set his hat on the table in the front hall, were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly. Rough across the knuckles, nails cut short, a scar along the right palm that wrapped around toward the wrist. He was, she thought, in some specific and hard-to-articulate way, someone who had been through something serious and had come out the other side of it still standing, but changed. I've got one room left, Margaret told him. $3 a week. That's fine. You want meals? Whatever's being served. You're Gideon Cross, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her steadily. That's right. You had a place out on the Eastern Ridge. I had a place, he said. He said it with no particular emotion, which made it worse somehow. Margaret gave him the room key and a towel, and that was the end of it. He nodded at Evelyn when he passed her in the hall. Not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement that she was there, and went upstairs. What happened to his place on the Eastern Ridge? Evelyn asked, once his footsteps had reached the upper hall. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, fire. When? September. Middle of the night. Took everything. His wife had died the previous year, fever, so it was just him and the 2 ranch hands. They all got out, but that was all they got out. She picked up the dish she'd been drying when Gideon knocked. He's been staying with neighbors since, working whatever work he can find. Proud man. Wouldn't accept charity. This is probably the first time he's paid for a room. Did they find out what started it? Margaret set the dish down very carefully on the shelf. No, she said. They did not find out what started it. The way she said it told Evelyn everything. Well, by the end of the second week, the storm had broken enough to let people move through the valley again, though not enough to clear the passes. Evelyn had established herself as someone who could be trusted with numbers, and 2 other businesses had asked her to look at their books. The general store, run by a cautious man named Edmund Graves, and a small assay office operated by a widow named Ruth Patton, who was trying to determine whether she could afford to keep the office open another season. She couldn't. That was the answer, and Evelyn told her so with as much care as she could, along with an alternative arrangement that might let Ruth rent the space to Consolidated's competitors, if any existed, which was a question that led to a silence. Consolidated doesn't have competitors, Ruth said. Not in Bloodstone. What happens if someone tries to compete? Ruth looked at her hands. She was a small woman with precise movements and a way of choosing her words like she was spending money she didn't have. Problems, she said finally. Equipment breaks down. Supply wagons don't arrive. People get discouraged. Physically? Sometimes. Evelyn thought about the fire on the Eastern Ridge. There are 37 families in this valley, she said, more to herself than to Ruth. I've now seen the books of 3 businesses. The pattern is identical in all 3. Consolidated is extracting income from this community systematically, not just from the mines, from every economic activity in the valley. Ruth said, "That's right. And nobody has ever organized any kind of collective response?" Ruth smiled, small and tired. "A man named Hargrove tried 4 years back. He was a cattle rancher, well liked. He started talking to people, writing letters to the territorial government. 2 months later, his cattle started dying. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. 1 or 2 a week. Something in the water, they said. By the time spring came, he had 9 head left out of 60 and a debt he couldn't service. He sold to Consolidated for pennies and left the valley." She folded her hands. "Nobody tried after that. They made an example of him." "They made an example of him," Ruth agreed. Evelyn walked back to the boarding house in the gray afternoon light, with the cold working through her coat and the shape of the problem becoming very clear in her mind. It was not just corruption. It was an ecosystem, a careful, deliberate system designed to make resistance feel not just dangerous, but futile. To make the people of Bloodstone Valley believe, on some level, that they deserved what they were getting because they were too small and too isolated to deserve anything better. She hated that with a specific, focused intensity that surprised her. Gideon Cross ate breakfast before everyone else, said about 12 words a day, and spent his evenings at the table in the corner of the common room reading whatever Margaret happened to have available. A 2-year-old newspaper, a farming almanac, once a collection of poetry that he read with no visible embarrassment. He helped Margaret with the firewood without being asked. He fixed the latch on the front door that had been sticking all winter, using tools he produced from his coat pocket the way a surgeon produces instruments. Evelyn found him useful to think alongside, which surprised her because he didn't talk much. It started on a Thursday evening when she brought her notes on Consolidated's pricing structure to the common room table because the kitchen was too cold, and he was already there with his almanac, and the only other option was her room. She arranged her papers. He glanced at them without comment. She worked. He read. After about 40 minutes, he said, without looking up, "Those are Consolidated's supply rates." She looked up. "How did you know?" "I've seen that format. They use the same invoice structure for everyone, same letterhead." He turned a page in the almanac. "My rate for coal was 18% higher than the rate they charged McMurtry, the man whose land butts against mine. Same delivery, same quantity. I asked them about it once." "What did they say?" "Said it was a rate variation based on delivery difficulty. My access road is steeper." His voice was entirely flat. "The difference in access between my property and McMurtry's is about 12 feet of elevation. I measured it." Evelyn set down her pen. "They charged you more because they could." "Because they knew I didn't have another option." He turned another page. "What are you doing with those figures?" "Building a picture. Every business in this valley is being squeezed by Consolidated at a different rate, and none of them know what the other businesses are paying. If they did, they'd know they were being played against each other." "Yes." He looked up then. He had dark eyes that were, she thought, somewhat more attentive than he usually let on. Like most of his attention was elsewhere when you talked to him, but not because he wasn't listening. More like he was listening to 2 things at once and managing both. "What are you planning to do with the picture when you've built it?" he asked. "I don't know yet. But you're building it anyway. It seems like someone should." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to the almanac. The next evening, he brought her his own records. Everything he'd saved from before the fire, which wasn't much, but included the Consolidated invoices and a handwritten accounting of the rate discrepancies he'd noticed. He set them on the table beside her papers without ceremony, went and got himself a cup of coffee, and sat back down. She understood that to be, in its own limited vocabulary, an offer of partnership. They began talking to people in the second week after the storm broke. Not publicly. Nothing that looked organized. Evelyn would visit a business on the pretext of bookkeeping assistance and, in the course of talking, ask what they paid for coal, for timber, for transport. Gideon would stop by the livery, or the smithy, or one of the smaller mining operations that bought from Consolidated stockpiles rather than pulling ore themselves. They compared notes at the boarding house table each evening, and the picture that assembled itself was worse than either of them had expected. Consolidated wasn't just overcharging, they were selectively overcharging, raising rates on businesses and individuals who had shown any independence, keeping rates lower for those who cooperated with whatever Consolidated wanted. A family named Pruitt, who had sold a strip of their grazing land to Consolidated without complaint 2 years ago, paid 22 cents per hundredweight for coal. A family named Donahue, whose patriarch had been vocal at a town meeting about the state of the valley's road. The road that Consolidated's ore wagons used but never maintained, paid 31 cents for the same quantity. They're running a loyalty program, Evelyn said. The discount is the reward for compliance. And the premium is the punishment for not complying. Gideon spread the comparison sheets on the table. They've got the Donahues so far under they can't put aside $1. I've talked to Frank Donahue. He knows it's not right, but he's got 4 children and he can't afford to be right about it. If we could show Frank Donahue that the Pruitts are paying 9 cents less per hundredweight, and that the only difference between the Donahues and the Pruitts is that meeting 2 years ago, he'd know it for certain what he already suspects. Would that be enough? Gideon was quiet for a moment. Maybe not by itself, but if he knew the Hendersons were in the same boat, and the Pattersons, and the Kellogg's. He looked at her. If they all knew they were being punished individually for things that weren't individual problems, they might stop feeling like it's their own fault. He nodded slowly. That's the thing about what Consolidated does. It makes every family think their problem is a personal failing, poor decisions, bad luck, not working hard enough. They don't see the pattern because they're not supposed to see it. They need to see it. They need to see it, he agreed. She thought about Hargrove, the rancher who'd tried 4 years ago and had his cattle systematically destroyed. She thought about the fire on the eastern ridge. She thought about the particular calculus that Consolidated had worked out. Just enough pressure to crush resistance, not enough to trigger a collective response. They'll know what we're doing, she said. If we start talking to families comparing rates, they'll know, Gideon said. They have people in this valley. I don't know who, but they do. They always do. So we don't have much time before they try to stop us. No. She looked at the papers on the table, the columns of numbers, the neat, damning arithmetic of a system designed to grind people down. Then we work faster, she said. The man from Consolidated came to Halloran's on a Thursday. He introduced himself as Harlan Voss, Regional Operations Manager, and he had the particular grooming of someone who wanted to look prosperous without looking extravagant. A good coat that wasn't quite flashy, a watch chain that caught the light just enough. He asked for Margaret Halloran, got her in the front hall, and spoke with the pleasant firmness of someone accustomed to having conversations go the way he wanted them to go. Evelyn happened to be in the kitchen, which shared a wall with the front hall. She did not move. We've heard there's been some interest in our pricing structures, Voss said, inquiries being made. I run a boarding house, Margaret said. I don't know anything about inquiries. Of course, I'm just having a general conversation. A pause. How's business, Mrs. Halloran? Manageable, I hope? Fine. Good to hear. Times can be difficult. We do what we can to support local establishments. Fair rates, reliable supply. The valley works best when everyone works together. Another pause. Longer. You have some new guests, I understand. Guests come and go. A woman from out of state, I believe. And Gideon Cross. His voice was pleasant and entirely without warmth. Mr. Cross is a man with understandable grievances, given his circumstances. We've found that men with grievances sometimes make poor decisions, encourage poor decisions in others. Margaret said nothing. Just a conversation, Voss repeated. No cause for concern. I hope you have a productive season, Mrs. Halloran. Evelyn heard the front door close. She came out of the kitchen to find Margaret standing in the hall with her arms folded and her expression that of someone who has just been reminded of something they already knew. How long do you think we have? Evelyn asked. Margaret looked at her. You heard that? All of it. Margaret unfolded her arms, folded them again. I don't know. Voss is the polished kind. He likes to give warning first. Gives you a chance to stop. And if you stop, he doesn't have to do anything messier. It looks better that way. And if we don't stop, then it gets messier. Evelyn went upstairs, knocked on Gideon's door, and told him about Voss. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How much have we compiled? He asked. Rate comparisons for 19 families. Supply contracts for 12 businesses. The coal pricing alone shows a spread of nearly 40% between the lowest paying and highest paying customers with no legitimate cost basis for the difference. She looked at him. It's enough to show a pattern. It might not be enough to take to a territorial court. What would be enough? Documentation of specific threats. Evidence that the rate manipulation is coordinated from the top, not incidental pricing. Testimony from people willing to go on record. She paused. And someone with the authority to act on it who isn't connected to Consolidated. The Territorial Land Office, Gideon said, or the Federal Marshal's Office. Consolidated has a mining charter. If the charter conditions were violated, the federal government has jurisdiction. He looked at the window. The light outside was the flat gray of late afternoon, the kind that made everything look equidistant and cold. Getting information to either of those requires getting someone out of the valley. Yes. The passes will be open in another month, maybe 6 weeks. We have 6 weeks to build a case that's too solid to ignore. She met his eyes. We keep the rate comparisons. We start documenting specific incidents. Who was threatened? When? By whom? We get names. We get witnesses who are willing to say it out loud. People are scared. I know. But scared people will talk when they know they're not alone. She thought of Frank Donahue with his 4 children and his impossible coal bills. Show someone the whole pattern. Let them see they're not the only one being punished. That changes things. Gideon looked at her with that double attentive look he had, like he was listening to more than just her words. You didn't plan for any of this, he said. No. You were supposed to be in Clearwater by now, married to somebody you've never met. She felt the truth of that land somewhere in her chest, not painfully exactly, but with weight. The future she'd arranged, steady habits and fair dealing, a man's name and a man's land and a life organized around a practical transaction, had been sitting at the edge of her thinking for 2 weeks, waiting for her to grieve it properly. She hadn't had time. I'm here instead, she said. You could still go. Storm's broken enough that the South Road might be passable. Stage will come through eventually. I know. He waited. I'm not going, she said. Not yet. He nodded once, slowly, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. Not warmer, exactly. More open. All right, he said. Then we've got 6 weeks. Well, over the following days, the work took on a different quality. Faster, more deliberate, and with the specific kind of focus that comes when you know someone is watching you work. Evelyn moved through the valley with purpose, calling on families with a ledger under her arm, in a manner that suggested practical helpfulness rather than investigation. She talked to Marta Henderson about her heating costs and left with the Hendersons' consolidated invoice. She helped the Kellogg's reconcile 3 months of confused accounts and in the process documented that their timber rate had increased twice in 11 months with no written explanation. She sat with Agnes Donahue, Frank's wife, sharp and bone-tired and very much aware of the trap they were in. And they talked for 2 hours, and by the end, Agnes had committed to providing a written account of a specific conversation between Frank and a consolidated foreman who had suggested the previous spring that it would be in the Donahues' interest to stop attending town meetings. He said it friendly, Agnes told her, like advice, but Frank knew what he meant. Would Frank write it down? What the man said, as close to verbatim as he can remember, with the date and the foreman's name. I'll make sure he does. Meanwhile, Gideon was doing something Evelyn hadn't asked him to do, but found herself grateful for. He was talking to the men who worked for Consolidated directly. The miners, the drivers, the supply crews. Not about organizing, nothing that would register as dangerous, just talking. He knew some of them from before the fire. He had the particular quality of someone other men found easy to be honest with, possibly because he didn't seem to need anything from them except the conversation itself. What he found was that Consolidated's upper management was not popular among its own workforce. Wages had been cut twice in 3 years. A section of the primary mine had collapsed the previous July. No deaths, fortunately, and the company had delayed repairs for 6 weeks while ore extraction continued through other sections. 2 workers had been dismissed for raising concerns about the repair timeline. Several more had been told, with varying degrees of directness, that their employment was contingent on their political silence. They're scared of their own workers, Gideon told her, which means they know what they've been doing isn't defensible. That's useful, Evelyn said. If we have mine workers willing to testify about the conditions and the dismissals, I've got 3 who might, given the right circumstances. What kind of circumstances? Ones where they believe the people they're talking to actually have the power to do something. They've been told before that it would be handled, and it wasn't. His voice was flat, but not bitter, the flatness of experience rather than defeat. They need to believe this time is different. Then we make sure this time is different. She said it with more certainty than she felt, because she knew what it would actually require. Getting out of the valley, reaching the territorial capital, presenting evidence to people who might prefer to look the other way. Consolidated was large and profitable and paid taxes and employed people and had lawyers, and making them understand that the cost of doing nothing would eventually be greater than the cost of acting. She had done difficult things before. She had walked into a stranger's office at 23 with nothing but her accounting skills and a need to eat and talked herself into a position on the strength of her competence. She had watched her mother die slowly and managed every financial decision of those last months alone and without falling apart until after the funeral, when she had finally allowed herself half an hour of complete dissolution before getting back up. She was not afraid of difficult things. But she understood, standing in Bloodstone Valley in the second month of a brutal winter with an enemy that had already burned a man's home to the ground and poisoned a man's cattle and crushed a decade's worth of quiet resistance, that difficult was not the right word for what lay ahead. The right word was dangerous. She looked at her papers, the columns of figures, the written accounts accumulating in a box under her bed. She thought of Agnes Donahue's face, exhausted and angry, and for the first time in a while, holding the edge of something that might eventually become hope. She kept working. On the 41st day of her stay in Bloodstone Valley, Evelyn received a letter from Harold Fenwick. It had taken 4 weeks to reach her, forwarded from Millhaven, rerouted through the valley's irregular mail service. It was brief and correct and entirely kind. He hoped she was safe. He understood that weather could be treacherous. He would, if she still intended to come, be happy to receive her when the roads permitted. If circumstances had changed and she had reconsidered, he understood that too, and wished her well in whatever she chose. She read it twice. He was, she thought, genuinely a decent man. The letters had not lied about that. She wrote back. She told him the truth, that she had been stranded, that she was safe, that she had found work and become involved in a situation that she was not yet in a position to leave. She thanked him for his patience and his understanding. She told him that she thought he would find someone better suited to the life he described, someone who wanted cattle and quiet and the long, uncomplicated horizon of Clearwater. And she apologized for the confusion. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing mail. She felt something when she did it. Not grief exactly. More like closing a door she had already walked away from, and finding that it was lighter than she'd expected. She went back to the table, to the box of statements and the columns of figures, and the careful, accumulating architecture of a case that might, if she could get it out of the valley in time, be enough to bring something like justice down on a company that had spent 8 years convincing an entire community they had no options. Bloodstone Valley was cold and isolated and full of people who had been deliberately ground down into silence. She was going to give them their voice back or exhaust herself trying. She picked up her pen. The box under Evelyn's bed had grown heavier. Not literally. It was still the same pine crate she'd found in Margaret's storage room, the one that had once held canned goods. But the weight of what it held had changed in character. In the first weeks, the documents inside felt provisional, like notes toward a case rather than a case itself. Now they felt like something more. 34 families, 21 businesses, rate comparisons, supply contracts, written accounts of specific conversations and specific threats, 3 sworn statements from Consolidated's own workers, and a ledger analysis showing 8 years of systematic price manipulation that varied almost perfectly with each customer's willingness to comply or resist. She knew the shape of the thing now. She could see how Consolidated had built itself into the valley's economy so thoroughly that attacking any single piece of it would look, to the untrained eye, like attacking the valley itself. That was the sophistication of it. The company had made itself necessary before it made itself predatory. and by the time the predation was obvious, the necessity was too entrenched to dislodge without pain. What she needed was someone who could see past the surface. What she had, for the moment, was Gideon Cross sitting across from her at Margaret's kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him, reading her summary for the second time. "The problem," he said, setting it down, "is the mine workers." "Which problem specifically?" "The ones willing to testify. I told them the right circumstances. I haven't delivered those yet." He turned the page over, looked at the blank back. "If Consolidated moves on us before we get word out, those 3 men lose their jobs at minimum, possibly more." "How much more?" He looked up at her. "The foreman who told Frank Donahue to stop attending meetings. His name is Cutter, Dillard Cutter. He's been with Consolidated for 6 years. Before that, nobody quite knows." He paused. "He was the one who came to my property 3 weeks before the fire. Told me Consolidated was interested in purchasing the Eastern Ridge land. I told him I wasn't selling." Evelyn held very still. "You never mentioned that." "I'm mentioning it now." "Did you have any witnesses to that conversation?" "One of my ranch hands, a man named Pete Alderman. He's been working out at the McCready operation on the south side since the fire." He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. "Pete's willing to talk, but he's not willing to put it in writing until he knows there's someone official on the other end." "That's fair," Evelyn said. "That's actually completely fair." "I know it is. It doesn't solve the problem." She sat back in her chair. Outside the kitchen window, the valley was doing something it hadn't done in 6 weeks. The light had a quality to it, thin and pale but genuine, that suggested the sun remembered it had a job. The snow on the roof lines was starting to release at the edges, slow drips that left dark patches in the white. The passes, per the last word from anyone who'd attempted them, were still brutal but no longer impassable. "March?" she said. "What?" "If someone left in the next week, rode south toward Reedsville, then took the main pass route east to the capital, how long would it take?" Gideon thought about it. "In reasonable conditions? 10 days, maybe 12. He looked at the window. "Conditions are not reasonable." "How long in unreasonable conditions?" 16 days, 20, if the pass at Cold Rock is still choked." He looked at her steadily. "Who are you thinking sends that person?" "I think I need to be the one to go." He didn't argue it immediately, which she appreciated. He sat with it for a moment, the way he did with most things, like he was actually considering it rather than marshaling a counterargument. "You'd be traveling alone," he said. "I'm aware. You've been in this valley for 6 weeks. You don't know the terrain between here and Reedsville. I know how to learn terrain, and I'd need a guide for the first section at minimum. Who would stay here and manage the documentation? Keep talking to people, keep the thing from falling apart while you're gone." "You," she said. "You know every family in this valley, or close enough. You know which ones are close to talking and which ones need more time. You know the mine workers. And if Consolidated decides, while you're gone, to make an example of someone." It was the real question. She'd been avoiding it, not because she didn't know it was there, but because it didn't have a good answer. "Then you do what you can," she said, "and I get back as fast as I can." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she heard the drip from the roof line outside, steady and irregular, and the sound of Margaret moving around upstairs, and somewhere further off a horse protesting something in the livery. "2 more weeks," he said finally. We use them. Every family we haven't talked to, we talk to. Every account we haven't documented, we document. We make the case as solid as we possibly can before you leave. And if Consolidated moves in those 2 weeks, then we deal with it." He looked at her. "You ever ride long distances alone?" "I rode from St. Louis to Millhaven on a horse I wasn't sure of when I was 19 because the stage was full and I couldn't wait. 3 days. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. "That's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They went back to work. The next 2 weeks had a quality she would remember for the rest of her life. Not pleasantly, exactly, but with the specific vividness of days that mattered. Every morning she was up before light, and every night she worked past the point where she could hold a pen steadily. She moved through the valley with the controlled urgency of someone who knows the window is closing and cannot afford to hurry in a way that shows. The families she talked to were not easy conversations. The Kellogg's took 3 visits before old Warren Kellogg would admit, out loud, what he already knew, that the timber rate increase after his son spoke at a town meeting was not coincidental. He was a big, deliberate man with a craftsman's hands and the long memory of someone who had built something from nothing and watched it get chipped away. When he finally said it, not the rate increase, but what it meant, what it was designed to mean, he said it quietly and then looked at his wife Edna, who looked back at him with an expression that suggested she had been waiting years for him to say it. "Will it help?" Warren asked Evelyn. "Writing it down, giving you the contract, will it actually do anything?" She was honest with him. "I don't know. I believe it will. I think the evidence is strong enough to compel a response from the territorial government, but I've never done this before. And Consolidated has more money and more influence than I do." She met his eyes. "What I can tell you is that doing nothing definitely doesn't work. We've seen that for 8 years." He wrote out his statement that evening. His handwriting was large and careful and precise. A craftsman's handwriting, she thought. The hardest conversation was with a young family named Whitfield. Joel and Sarah, both in their late 20s, with a baby and a failing cattle operation and a specific defeated exhaustion that comes not from a single disaster, but from a long series of small losses that never quite stop. Joel Whitfield had been dismissed from a part-time position with Consolidated Supply Operation 8 months ago, after someone reported that he'd been asking questions about the mine collapse and the delayed repairs. He hadn't been able to prove it was retaliation. He'd turned it over in his mind constantly. The timing, the stated reason for dismissal, the careful nothing they'd given him in writing, and not been able to get past the not being able to prove it. "That's the point," Evelyn told him. "They keep it just ambiguous enough that you can't be certain. That's deliberate." "But if I can't be certain, you can be certain that 12 other people in this valley have stories that look exactly like yours. Same timing, same stated reasons, same careful documentation that says nothing actionable." She put the comparison sheets on his kitchen table. "Joel, you're not imagining it. Nobody in this room is imagining it." Sarah Whitfield, who had said nothing up to that point, put her hand flat on the papers. "What do you need from us?" Gideon came with her to 2 of the mine workers. He knew them better. A man named Ira Flood, who had worked Consolidated's primary shaft for 4 years, and a younger man called Theo Birch, who had been one of the 2 dismissed for raising concerns about the repair timeline. Ira was cautious and precise with his words. Theo was angry in the way that young men are angry when they've been treated badly and haven't found a productive place to put it yet. Evelyn let Gideon handle most of those conversations. He had a way with the mine workers that she didn't, not warmer exactly, but more horizontal. He'd lost something too. They knew it, and it counted. "Why are you doing this?" Ira Flood asked, looking at Gideon rather than Evelyn. "You don't owe this valley anything. They never helped you when your place burned." "Some of them did," Gideon said. "McMurtry took in my horses. The Hendersons gave Pete Alderman work when I couldn't pay him. People helped where they could. But nobody called it what it was." "No." He didn't flinch from it. "They were scared. I was scared. Angry, but scared. And alone." A pause. "We're not as alone now." Ira looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "Write it down," he said finally. "I'll sign it." Harlan Voss came back on a Thursday, which was 12 days before Evelyn had planned to leave. This time he didn't come to Halloran's. He held what he called a community meeting at the saloon, an open invitation, casually extended through the business owners along the main street, nothing formal. Just Consolidated, wanting to have a conversation with the Valley about the upcoming season's supply arrangements. Gideon said they should go. Evelyn agreed for reasons she didn't entirely explain to him. The saloon was fuller than she expected. Most of the business owners were there, and a fair number of the ranching families, the Donahues, the Kellogg's, the Hendersons, some of Consolidated's own workers. Voss stood at the far end of the room with another man she hadn't seen before, shorter and rounder, with the particular watchfulness of someone whose actual job is to watch. Voss was polished and easy and completely in control of himself. "We want to talk about the Valley's future," he said, after the opening pleasantries were done. "Consolidated's been part of this community for 8 years. We've grown together. and we want to make sure we go into the next season with a clear understanding on both sides. Someone near the back, she couldn't see who, said, "Understanding of what?" "Of the mutual benefits we provide." Voss smiled. "Consolidated employs close to 60 people in this valley directly. Our supply operations support another 30 or 40 businesses and households. We're not outside Bloodstone Valley, friends. We're part of it." "Part of it that keeps raising prices," Warren Kellogg said. He said it quietly but not carefully. It came out the way something comes out when a man has been holding it long enough that it starts slipping past his control. A small silence. Voss looked at Warren Kellogg with an expression of patient concern. "I understand that sentiment, Warren. Input costs have been rising across the territory. We've tried to absorb what we can." "My rate went up 11 cents per hundredweight since October," Warren said. "Tom Henderson's rate went up 4 cents. Same product, same distance." Now the silence was different, heavier. Voss kept his face perfectly composed. "Supply arrangements are negotiated individually. Different factors." "What factors?" Evelyn said it from across the room, and her voice was level. Several people looked at her. Voss looked at her. The round, watchful man beside Voss looked at her and kept looking. "What specific factors account for an 11-cent difference between properties less than 2 miles apart?" she said. "I've reviewed both contracts. The access roads are comparable, the delivery schedules are the same, the volumes are similar. What's the factor?" Voss's smile didn't break, but something behind it changed slightly. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Evelyn Hart. I've been working as a bookkeeper in the valley." She kept her voice pleasant and precise. "I'm curious about the factors, for the purposes of financial planning for my clients." "Supply arrangements are confidential business matters," Voss said, "not appropriate for public discussion. Then perhaps you could meet privately with each of the business owners here and explain the specific factors in their individual cases." She looked around the room. "I'm sure they'd all benefit from understanding why their rates are what they are." A few people were looking at her. A few more were looking at Voss. Warren Kellogg was looking at the table in front of him, but his jaw was set. Voss moved on. He was too controlled to push back directly in a room full of witnesses, and she knew it, which was partly why she'd said it. Let him show, in public, that he wouldn't answer the question. Let the people in the room feel the fact that there was no answer to give. After the meeting, walking back to Halloran's in the early dark, Gideon said, "That was deliberate." "Yes. Voss knows you're not just a bookkeeper now. He probably already knew, but now it's on the table." She pulled her coat tighter. "He was going to know eventually. I'd rather he know with 20 witnesses in the room than privately. He'll move faster now." "I know." She looked at the dark sky, the stars beginning to show where the clouds had thinned. "I need to leave sooner." "How soon?" 5 days, maybe 4. He was quiet for most of the walk back. When they reached the boarding house door, he stopped. "There are things you should know about the route," he said, "for the mountain section." They went inside, and he sat with her for 2 hours, going over the terrain between Bloodstone and the capital. The roads, the pass conditions, the settlements where she could stop. He knew it well. He'd made the ride 4 times before his wife got sick, when he still had reasons to travel to the capital for land business. He drew it from memory on the back of a supply invoice, and his handwriting was nothing like his appearance, small and precise and careful. She studied the map until she had it. At some point, Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs of something warm and set them on the table without comment and went back to bed. It was, Evelyn thought, a very Margaret thing to do. "You should take Pete Alderman with you for the first section," Gideon said, "at least to Reedsville. He knows that stretch and he's been wanting a reason to get out of the valley. Pete works for McCready. McCready will lend him. I'll explain it." She nodded. She looked at the hand-drawn map. Then she looked at Gideon. There was something she'd been aware of for a while, sitting in the general vicinity of everything else she was aware of, not demanding attention but present. It had to do with the way they worked alongside each other, the specific ease of it, the fact that they rarely needed to explain things at length because they'd developed a shorthand that neither of them had decided to develop. It had just happened the way useful things happen, through repetition and necessity. It had to do with the fire on the eastern ridge and the cut above his eye that had long since healed, and the way he sometimes looked at the valley from Margaret's front window, with an expression that was not quite grief, but was grief adjacent. The look of someone who had lost something here and had not yet decided whether that meant they should leave or stay. She didn't say any of this. It wasn't the moment for it, and she wasn't sure she'd say it even if it were. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she gathered her papers and he stood, and they went upstairs separately, which was how they always went, which was how it was. Not. The next 4 days moved fast and strange. She finished the documentation. Everything she had, every rate comparison, every sworn statement, every contract, every handwritten account of threats made and businesses pressured, she organized into 2 complete sets. One she would carry, one she gave to Margaret Halloran with instructions that if Evelyn did not return within 6 weeks, Margaret should find a way to get it to the territorial capital by whatever means available. Margaret took the packet with both hands and held it like it weighed more than it did. "You coming back?" she asked. "Planning to." "Planning and doing are different." "I'm aware." Evelyn looked at her. "Thank you for everything. The room, the work, letting us use your kitchen table for 2 months." "You reorganized my books," Margaret said. "First time in 3 years I've known exactly where I stand." She paused. "That's not nothing." She also spent an afternoon with Agnes and Frank Donahue, going over what to do if things escalated in her absence. Frank had found a steadiness in the previous 2 weeks that she hadn't seen in him before, something about naming the problem out loud, about understanding that it was deliberate, had shifted something in him from shame into anger, and anger, properly directed, was more useful than shame. "Don't do anything that gives them an excuse," she told him. "If Cutter or anyone from Consolidated approaches you, be civil. Don't sign anything new. Don't let them pressure you into a meeting without witnesses." "And if they come at night?" Frank said. He meant it the way Gideon meant the fire, the thing they all knew happened but never said directly. "If they come at night, you get your family out and you get to Gideon." She looked at him steadily. "He'll be here." On her last evening, she went through her bag twice. She had the documentation wrapped in oilskin against the weather. She had what money remained. Not much. Enough. She had the hand-drawn map and a compass that had belonged to her father, which was the one thing she'd brought from Illinois that wasn't practical. Gideon knocked on her door at what she estimated was about 9 o'clock. She let him in. He stood inside the door with his hat in his hands, which she noticed because he almost never held his hat. He either wore it or put it on a surface. "Pete'll be at the South Road at first light," he said. "He's got a pack horse sorted." "Good. You've got the copies?" "Both sets." He nodded. He looked at the bag on the bed, the coat folded over the chair. He looked at the compass on the washstand. "Your father's?" he asked. "He died when I was 14. It's the only thing of his I have." She picked it up, weighed it in her palm. "I don't know why I brought it. Sentimentality, I suppose." "Nothing wrong with that." "I always thought there was. Efficiency, practicality. Those are what matter. Things are things." "Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife had a blue glass bottle she'd gotten from her mother. Just a bottle, so it held ink originally, I think, or medicine. She kept wildflowers in it in the summers. It was the first thing I went back for after the fire." He paused. "It was gone. The whole place was gone. But that was the thing I was looking for." She stood with the compass in her hand and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything right to say, and he didn't seem to need her to say it. "I want you to take something," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper. "That's a copy of my land deed for the Eastern Ridge. Originals filed in the Capitol. The deed is in my name. It's legal, it's registered, it's proof of ownership. Consolidated's been spreading the word that my fire vacated the claim. It didn't." He put the paper on the washstand. "If you get to the Capitol, find the land office. Make sure the record is intact. You're worried they've tampered with it." "I'm worried about a lot of things." She picked up the deed and put it with the documentation inside the oilskin. "I'll check it." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her given name. He'd been calling her Miss Hart for 2 months, which she had not minded, which was its own kind of information. Whatever happens in the Capitol. He stopped, started again. "I know you planned a different kind of life. Before the storm. Whatever comes out of this doesn't have to. Gideon? She said it gently but clearly. Let's get the valley sorted first. He held her gaze for a moment, then something in him settled, and he nodded. First light, he said. First light, she agreed. Us. She slept badly and woke at 4 a.m, which was early enough. She dressed in the dark by feel, the way you do when you've been in a small room long enough that your hands know where everything is. She splashed cold water on her face. She put on her coat. She picked up the compass and held it for a moment. Cold brass, the needle trembling slightly as it found north, and then put it in her coat pocket. At the top of the stairs, she stopped. Down the hall, under the door at the end, she could see the thin line of lamplight that was Gideon's room. He was awake too. He hadn't said goodnight because he hadn't planned to sleep. She stood there for a moment, not going forward and not going back. The boarding house was quiet around her. Margaret's even breathing through the door on the left, the cold creak of the building settling in the pre-dawn, the distant sounds of the valley beginning its day, the horse in the livery, the first thin blue hint of light at the far end of the hall window. Then she went downstairs and out into the cold and turned south toward the road and didn't look back. That was the thing about difficult things. You had to commit to the direction or you'd stand on the stairs forever. The valley was dark and frozen and very quiet at that hour, the mountains black shapes against a sky that was only beginning to suggest it might eventually become day. Her breath made clouds in the still air. Her boots crunched on the frozen mud of the main street and then on the packed snow of the south road. And then she heard the sound of Pete Alderman and 2 horses waiting in the pre-dawn shadow of a cottonwood. And she told herself, once, firmly, with all the authority she had, that she was going to make it there and back. Then she kept walking. Pete Alderman was not a talker, which suited Evelyn fine. He was a compact, weathered man somewhere in his mid-40s, with the particular quietness of someone who had spent most of his working life outdoors and had stopped filling silence with words sometime in his 30s. He knew the South Road well enough to navigate it in the gray pre-dawn without a lantern, which was its own kind of reassurance. He had packed efficiently, 2 horses, sensible provisions, a bedroll each, and a long rifle he wore across his back, with the casual familiarity of a tool rather than a weapon. They rode without talking for the first 2 hours, which gave Evelyn time to watch the valley recede behind them and think about everything she might have missed. That was the thing about leaving. It activated all the doubt she'd managed to keep quiet while she was working. Had she built the case thoroughly enough? Were the sworn statements solid, or were there gaps a lawyer could widen into something useless? Was Margaret safe with the duplicate packet? Was Gideon— She stopped herself on Gideon, because that line of thinking was long and she had many miles ahead of her and it wasn't useful. How bad is the Reedsville Pass this time of year, she asked, when the silence had run its course. Pete considered it the way he considered most things, without hurry. Passable. Won't be comfortable. How not comfortable? 3 sections where the trails may be 4 feet wide with a drop on the left side you don't want to think about too long. He glanced at her. You ride steady? Steady enough? Then it's fine. It was not entirely fine. The pass took the better part of a day. Not the width of the trail, which was manageable if you kept your eyes on the horse's ears rather than the edge, but the cold, which was a different category of cold than the valley. Up in the pass, it was the kind that worked through wool and leather both, and settled into the joints and made everything slower, including thought. The horses didn't like it. Evelyn's did a thing with its head twice on the narrowest section that she didn't appreciate and chose not to revisit afterward. But they came through it, and on the other side the road widened and descended through a pine forest that blocked the wind, and Pete produced dried venison from his pack without ceremony and handed her a piece. And they ate without stopping because stopping in that cold felt inadvisable. You think it'll work? Pete said after a long while. The case? All of it. Going to the Capitol, getting someone to do something. She turned the question over honestly. I think the evidence is strong. I think the territorial government has reasons to act that go beyond just what's right. Consolidated's mining charter has federal conditions attached to it, which means if they violated those conditions, there are people in the Capitol whose jobs require them to respond. She paused. Whether those people will actually do their jobs is another question. They won't want to. Consolidated pays a lot of taxes. I know. So why do you think it'll work? Because I'm going to make it harder for them to refuse than to act, she said. That's all I know how to do. Pete chewed his venison. Gideon thinks you can do it. She looked at him. He said that? Not in those exact words. Gideon doesn't say things in exact words. A pause. But yeah, he thinks you can do it. She faced forward, back to the road, and didn't respond to that, because there was nothing to say to it that wasn't either too small or too large for the moment. They reached Reedsville in 4 days, which was faster than the estimate and slower than Evelyn wanted. Reedsville was not much, a supply town on the junction of two territorial roads, existing primarily because it was where people stopped before attempting either of the two mountain routes. It had a hotel that charged reasonable rates and served food that was hot, if not distinguished, and a telegraph office, which was the thing Evelyn cared about. She sent 2 telegrams. The first to the Office of Territorial Land Records in the capital, asking for confirmation that a land deed filed under the name of Gideon Cross for property in Bloodstone Valley was on record and intact. The second to a name she had found in the territorial directory at Reedsville's small post office, a federal land commissioner named Arthur Price, whose jurisdiction included the mining charter territories. She didn't know Price. She knew his title, his office address, and the fact that his position existed specifically to oversee the conditions of corporate mining charters in the territory. That was enough to try. The telegraph operator, a young man with ink-stained fingers, read her second message twice before sending it. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Send it," she said. And sheet. She spent the evening in the hotel room going over everything in the packet again, not because she expected to find errors, but because she needed to know it cold. Every number, every name, every date. She needed to be able to walk into a room in the Capitol and produce any piece of it from memory, because the moment she fumbled or hesitated, she would look like someone who didn't know what she was talking about, and she could not afford to look like that. Pete had found a room down the hall. He knocked on her door at about 8 o'clock. "I'm heading back in the morning," he said when she opened it. "McCready's expecting me." "I know. Thank you, Pete." He looked at her for a moment with that appraising stillness. "You need anything before I go?" "I need to know how to find a reliable horse trader in this town." He told her. Then he said, "You tell Gideon, boss, when you get back, that I signed what I signed and I meant it. He'll know what that means." "I'll tell him." Pete nodded once and went back to his room, and that was the last she saw of him, because she was up and out before dawn, and he was not the kind of man who did farewells. She made the capital in 11 days. She would not remember them as good days, but she would remember them as hers. The particular loneliness of long riding in cold country, the negotiations with herself that happened somewhere around the 6th hour of each day, when her body made a serious case for stopping and her mind refused it. The horse she'd bought in Reedsville was not beautiful, but was sound, and had a cooperative disposition she was grateful for. She named it nothing, because naming it would have made it harder to leave behind. Harding City announced itself first as a smell, coal smoke and industry, and the particular density of too many people in one place, and then as sound, and then as light, the gas lamps along the main avenue burning gold in the early evening when she rode in. She had not been in a city since leaving Illinois, and it hit her strangely, the noise and the press of it, after 2 months in Bloodstone Valley and 11 days of pine forests and empty road. She found a room, ate something she couldn't remember afterward, and slept for 9 hours, which was more sleep than she'd had in any single stretch since she'd come to the valley. In the morning, she went to work. The Office of Territorial Land Records first, because she'd sent the telegram and needed to follow up in person, and because Gideon's land deed was not a small thing. The clerk at the front desk was a precise, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Cathcart, who located the file with professional efficiency and confirmed that the deed was on record and intact, exactly as originally filed. "Has anyone made inquiries about this record recently?" Evelyn asked. "Any requests to review or modify it?" Mrs. Cathcart looked at her over her reading spectacles. "That's not information I can share generally." "I'm not asking generally. I'm asking because I have reason to believe that a company with a financial interest in disputing this claim may have attempted to access or alter this record." A small pause. "What company?" "Consolidated Rock and Mineral." Mrs. Cathcart looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the file. There was an inquiry in January, she said carefully. A lawyer representing a corporate client asked to review the record. He was informed that the record could be reviewed but not modified without a court order. Did he attempt to obtain a court order? Not through this office. Evelyn wrote it down. I'd like a certified copy of the deed, please, and a written confirmation of the record's integrity and the January inquiry. Mrs. Cathcart studied her. You're planning to use this in some kind of proceeding. I'm planning to be prepared, Evelyn said. The copy and the confirmation, please. She paid the fee and waited, and walked out 40 minutes later with 2 more documents in the oilskin packet. Arthur Price's office was in a building 3 blocks east, on the 4th floor of a stone structure that smelled of old paper and radiator heat. His secretary, a young man with an efficient manner and the faint impression of someone working harder than his title suggested, told her that Commissioner Price was occupied. I sent a telegram 6 days ago, Evelyn said. I'd like to know if he received it. The commissioner receives many, Evelyn Hart, regarding Consolidated Rock and Minerals charter violations in Bloodstone Valley. She kept her voice pleasant. I've ridden 11 days to be here. I have documentation of systematic fraud, rate manipulation, labor violations, destruction of private property, and witness intimidation. I would like please to speak with Commissioner Price. The secretary looked at her for a long moment. Wait here, he said. She waited 22 minutes, which she spent reading the territorial statutes posted on the office wall and finding, with some satisfaction, 3 specific charter conditions that Consolidated appeared to have violated. Then the door opened and Arthur Price appeared. He was older than she'd expected, close to 60, with white hair and the careful posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where posture mattered. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the particular assessment of someone deciding in the first 10 seconds whether the person in front of them is worth their time. She met it directly, without softening it. Miss Hart, he said, come in. The meeting lasted 3 hours. She had prepared for it to be difficult, and it was, but not in the way she'd anticipated. Price was not dismissive. He was careful. A different and in some ways harder thing to navigate. He asked precise questions. He pushed back on several of the rate comparisons, wanting to know her methodology for controlling variables. He challenged 2 of the sworn statements on the grounds that they were written by parties with financial interest in the outcome, which she acknowledged and then dismantled by showing him the corroborating documentation from Consolidated's own pricing records, obtained through copies that Ira Flood had kept from his time in the supply chain. This foreman Cutter, Price said, reading the section about the pre-fire visit to Gideon Cross's property. You have 1 witness to the conversation. I have 1 witness and a fire that occurred 23 days later with no established cause. She kept her voice even. The land deed inquiry at the records office happened 4 months after the fire. Consolidated was attempting to verify whether the destruction of the property invalidated the ownership claim. Which it doesn't, but someone told them to check, which suggests someone believed it might. She leaned forward slightly. Commissioner, the pattern here is not ambiguous. It's only ambiguous if you look at each incident in isolation. Consolidated has spent 8 years making sure that each individual incident looks isolated. That's the strategy. Price looked at the papers spread across his desk. He was quiet for a while. How many families, he said, would you say are directly harmed by the pricing practices? 31. Based on my documentation, there are likely more that I didn't reach. And you have rate comparisons for all 31? For 27. The other 4 are supported by account records and consistent pattern evidence. And the labor violations at the mine, the dismissals, the delayed repairs, 3 workers willing to provide testimony, 2 more who would speak informally but not on record at this time. He looked at her. This time. If the government acts, the informal witnesses will become formal ones. They need to know action is being taken before they'll put their names on paper. They've been let down before. By whom? By exactly the kind of hesitation I am currently watching you consider. That landed. He looked at her with something that might have been irritation or might have been respect. It was difficult to tell, and she suspected it was both. I need time to review this, he said. How much time? A week, 10 days. She thought of Bloodstone Valley, of Gideon with the mine workers' statements and the Donahues and the Kellogg's holding it together, of Harlan Voss, who now knew she was gone and what she'd been building. "A week," she said. "I'll be in the city. Where are you staying?" She gave him the address of the rooming house she'd found. He wrote it down without apparent irony, a federal commissioner noting the address of a woman from a frontier valley who had ridden 11 days alone through mountain passes. She thought her mother would have found the whole thing extraordinary, and then she thought that her mother would have told her to stop being distracted and finish the job. She stood and gathered her papers. "Miss Hart," Price said. She looked back. "The evidence is stronger than I expected," he said. It was not quite a compliment. It was something more valuable, so an honest statement. "I know," she said. "I built it to be." The week in Harding City was its own kind of endurance. She was not accustomed to waiting, and waiting in a strange city was worse than waiting in a place she knew, because she couldn't fill the time with useful motion. She went to the Territorial Library and researched every legal precedent she could find for charter revocation. She found a lawyer, a woman named Dorothea Marsh, who practiced in a small two-room office and had a reputation, per the clerk at the records office, for taking difficult cases, and spent an afternoon going over the documentation with her. "This is organized," Dorothea Marsh said, in the tone of someone who had reviewed poorly organized documentation enough times to be genuinely relieved when it wasn't. "I was a bookkeeper. You were a thorough one." She set down the rate comparisons. "Price is the right avenue. If he issues a formal review notice, Consolidated has to respond within 30 days. That freezes their operational authority pending the outcome." She paused. "The question is whether Price will actually do it or whether he'll sit on this until it becomes someone else's problem." "What's his history?" "Complicated. He's not corrupt. I don't think he takes money, if that's what you're asking. But he's cautious. He doesn't like exposure." Dorothea looked at her. "He needs to believe that doing nothing is riskier than doing something. Right now, acting against Consolidated is the risk. You need to make inaction the risk." "How?" "Other officials, territorial press, anyone whose attention would make Price's inaction visible." She said it crisply, the way practical people say unpleasant things. Politics is about who's watching. Evelyn spent the following morning at the offices of the Harding City Territorial Record, where she spoke with a journalist named Silas Vane, who covered land and commerce for the paper. She did not ask him to write anything. She gave him a summary of the rate comparisons. No sworn statements, nothing that would expose her witnesses before she was ready, and told him that she was presenting a case to Commissioner Price's office regarding charter violations in the mining sector. Silas Vane was around her age, with the skeptical attention of someone who had been fed false stories enough times to distrust all stories until proven otherwise. He asked careful questions. He was most interested in the pricing differential data because it was concrete and verifiable and the kind of thing readers could understand without legal background. "How did you compile this?" he asked. "By talking to people." "Business owners in the valley?" "Yes." "They gave you their actual invoice rates?" "When they understood why it mattered." She looked at him steadily. "They're not stupid. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't have proof that it was deliberate rather than incidental. And you provided that proof." "The numbers provided it. I just put them side by side." He looked at his notes. "If I were to write a piece about pricing practices in the territorial mining sector, hypothetically, sourced from public data and available records, that would be accurate journalism," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll need a few days to verify independently. You have my address." She stood. "Don't use my name or my witnesses' names yet. When the time comes, I'll tell you." She walked out into the gray Harding City afternoon with the particular feeling of someone who has set several things in motion and now has to wait to see which ones take hold. The telegram came on the 5th day. It was from Margaret Halloran, which meant Margaret had gone to the trouble of getting to Reedsville or finding someone to carry a message, because Bloodstone Valley had no telegraph. The fact that Margaret had done it told Evelyn the content before she read it. "Gideon taken by Consolidated men Tuesday night. Held at Mine Camp North Ridge. Evidence destroyed. Town frightened. Come back. M.H." She read it twice, standing on the sidewalk outside the telegraph office with the cold working at her face, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the compass and went straight back to Price's office. His secretary started to say something about an appointment. "I need to see him now," Evelyn said. She said it quietly, which was more effective than if she had said it any other way. Price saw her in 10 minutes. She put the telegram on his desk. He read it again. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her. "The evidence was destroyed? Margaret Halloran has a duplicate set. I have what I brought here." She kept her voice controlled, because losing control of it would not help Gideon and would not help the 31 families in Bloodstone Valley, and she was going to hold on to that fact. Consolidated has now taken a man into custody without legal authority and destroyed documentation relevant to a federal investigation. If you were uncertain whether this rose to the level requiring federal action, Commissioner, it does now. Taking someone into custody? They burned his home 8 months ago when he refused to sell his land. They have a history of physical reprisal. I'm telling you, he is in danger. I can't dispatch federal marshals on the basis of a telegram from a boarding house. Then come with me. She looked at him across the desk. Ride to Bloodstone Valley, see it yourself. Or send a deputy ahead while you prepare the formal authorization. But do something that isn't waiting, because a man who trusted me is sitting in a mining camp on a ridge in the middle of a territory that doesn't apparently have anyone willing to help him, and I am not going back empty-handed. Price sat back in his chair. He looked at the telegram. He looked at Evelyn. You said there was a journalist, he said. She blinked. I said a journalist had been provided with some information. Silas Vane at the record. He said it as a statement. You went to him. I gave him public data and told him to verify independently. Price was quiet for a moment, then in a tone that contained something like reluctant acknowledgement. You're making inaction the riskier choice. Commissioner, she said, I'm asking you to do your job. Something crossed his face. Not offense, she thought, or not only offense. More like the look of a man who has been doing his job at a careful, insulated distance for 20 years and has just been reminded that the job has actual weight to it. I'll have authorization paperwork prepared by morning, he said. A deputy will ride ahead. I'll follow with 2 marshals within 48 hours. I need to leave tonight. You need rest. I need to leave tonight, she said again. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and went to the door and told his secretary to prepare the preliminary documentation immediately. She sat down, finally. Her legs, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Not from fear, she thought, but from the effort of holding everything very still for a very long time. She bought supplies in 2 hours, traded the horse for a faster one at additional cost, and was on the road by 7 that evening. It was stupid to ride at night, and she knew it. She went slowly, which partly mitigated the stupidity. She had a lantern, and she used it, and she kept the horse to a walk on the sections she didn't know. And she stopped twice when the trail was ambiguous and waited and looked until she was certain. She did not fall off the horse. She did not make a wrong turn. She made 30 miles before the cold became categorical, and she stopped at a woodcutter's way station she'd noted on the ride out, a 3-walled structure with a roof and a fire pit, and slept for 4 hours with her back against the horse's flank for warmth. She dreamed of nothing, which was the most efficient thing she could have done. Back on the road before first light. She had 11 days coming in, and she was going to do it in 7 going back, because 7 was what Gideon might have. She thought about him in the mining camp on the North Ridge. She thought about what Consolidated would want from him. A signature, probably. Something that let them formalize what they'd been doing informally. A statement recanting his allegations. An agreement to sell the Eastern Ridgeland. Something that would, in their arithmetic, make capturing him worthwhile. She thought about whether he would give it to them. She decided she knew the answer. He would not give it to them for as long as he could hold out, which meant she had to move faster than they expected her to move, and she had to bring enough with her that when she came back through that valley, it would not be alone. The horse covered ground. She covered ground. The mountains came up ahead of her, still white but different than they'd been on the way out. The passes looser, the snow settling rather than fresh, and the light each morning a little more gold than the morning before. Spring was somewhere behind the white, waiting its turn. The territory was immense and indifferent, and full of distances that didn't care about urgency, and she rode through it with her jaw set, and her eyes forward, and the compass in her pocket clicking faintly against a button each time the horse changed gait. On the 3rd day out from Harding City, she stopped at a small settlement called Birch Crossing for water and found 2 men she hadn't expected. A young woman running a trading post pointed her to the far end of the single street, where a man with a federal deputy's badge was waiting with a spare horse and better supplies than she'd managed. Commissioner Price's office, the deputy said. His name was Caleb Hurst, 20-something, with the look of someone who had recently graduated from wanting adventure to understanding what adventure actually felt like. He said you'd be coming through. How'd he know my route? Said you seemed like someone who'd take the most direct one. A pause. He also said to give you this. He handed her a document, official seal, Price's signature, and the language she'd been hoping for, a formal notice of federal investigation into Consolidated Rock and Minerals Charter compliance, with authority for immediate protective action in cases of suspected violence or unlawful detention. She read it twice. When are the marshals arriving in Bloodstone? She asked. 4 days behind me. Commissioner's coming himself. He said something about, he said, and I'm quoting, that he'd spent 20 years being cautious and he was going to see this one through. She looked at the document in her hands, the seal, the signature, the weight of the thing. Good, she said, and folded it into the oilskin. They rode together the rest of the way. Hurst was better company than Pete, more inclined to talk, which she found she didn't mind because it kept her from spinning in her own thoughts. He had no particular knowledge of Bloodstone Valley, but he was competent on the trail and didn't complain about pace, which was the main thing. On the 6th night, camped below the last pass before the valley, she sat by the fire and thought about what she was riding into. Gideon was in the mine camp. She didn't know his condition. She didn't know whether Consolidated had used physical force. Harlan Voss was the polished kind. He'd said so himself. He preferred leverage to violence when leverage was available. They'd want something from Gideon. They'd try persuasion first, maybe threat, maybe the specific cruelty of isolation, keeping a man alone in a cold place long enough that the walls start to close. She thought of his face when he'd said we're not as alone now. The careful way he'd said it, like he was testing the truth of it. She thought of the look in his room, the lamplight under the door, the two of them not quite saying what was in the room alongside them. She fed more wood to the fire. You know the man they took? Hurst asked. He'd been watching her stare at the fire for a while. Yes. Is he the kind who'll hold? She thought about the fire on the eastern ridge, about the way Gideon had turned up at Halloran's, paying for a room, so when everything else was gone, too proud for charity, but not too proud for honest work. About the way he'd appeared at her table with his old invoices without explaining himself because he'd decided to trust her and didn't need to make a speech about it. He'll hold, she said. She was back on the road before Hurst had finished his coffee, and she didn't apologize for it, and he didn't ask her to. The pass the next morning was the worst section of the return. Ice glazed in the early hour, the trail narrowed by new drifting, and a section near the summit where the horse stepped wrong, and she had 30 seconds of absolute controlled terror before they both recovered their footing and kept moving. She spoke to the horse in a steady, low voice through those 30 seconds. Not words exactly, just sound, the kind of sound that communicates I am still here, and I am not panicking, and the horse apparently found it credible enough. They came down out of the pass in the early afternoon, and the valley spread below them in the white winter light, and she saw it the way she hadn't been able to see it when she arrived, as a whole thing. The settlement at the center and the ridgelines around it and the dark smear of the mine operations to the north, which was where Gideon was, and which was the direction she was going as soon as she reached the valley floor. Margaret met her at the boarding house door with the particular relief of someone who had been counting days. How long? Evelyn asked. They took him 4 days ago, Tuesday night, 6 men from the camp. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. He didn't fight. He told me later, told the Donahues who saw it. He said to let him go, told them not to do anything. He knew I'd come back. Yes. Margaret looked at her. The evidence they burned was the original copies, but I have the second packet, and people in this valley have been talking since he was taken, openly, more than they ever have. They're angry. They're frightened and angry both. Frank Donahue has been keeping people organized, not doing anything, just making sure everyone stays connected. Agnes has been going house to house. She paused. Warren Kellogg showed up at the mine camp the day after they took Gideon. Just stood outside it for 2 hours. Didn't say anything, didn't do anything. Just stood there so they'd know someone was watching. Evelyn felt something in her chest that had been drawn tight for 7 days release a fraction of a degree. "The federal marshals are 4 days behind me," she said. "Commissioner Price is coming himself, but I'm not waiting 4 days." She looked at Margaret. "I need to know the layout of that camp." Margaret looked at her. "Gideon drew it for me once," she said, after a moment. "Last autumn, before all of this. He'd been up there for a labor dispute about wages. He drew it on the back of a mail envelope." She paused. "I think I still have it." She did. It was a rough drawing. Rooms, structures, the perimeter, 2 access points, a note in Gideon's small handwriting about where the night watchman stood. It was 8 months old, and Evelyn had no way of knowing what had changed. But it was more than nothing, and more than nothing was what she had to work with. She sat at Margaret's kitchen table with the envelope drawing and Hurst across from her and Margaret standing at the stove, and she thought about Gideon telling the Donahues to let him go, telling them not to do anything, knowing she would come back. He was right that she'd come back. He was wrong to think she'd wait for the marshals. She started planning. The plan was not good. Evelyn knew this going in, which was different from not knowing and better than pretending otherwise. A good plan would have had more people, more time, and a mine camp layout that wasn't drawn from memory 8 months ago on the back of a mail envelope by a man who'd been there under different circumstances. What she had instead was a workable plan, one that accounted for its own gaps and didn't pretend to be more than it was. She spent the evening with Hurst and the envelope drawing, and Margaret, who turned out to know more about the mine camp's rhythms than Evelyn expected, because Margaret had been feeding 2 of the supply drivers for 2 years, and people who ate regularly at the same table eventually told you things without meaning to. "Night crew changes at midnight," Margaret said. "The main operation shuts down around 10. They don't run the heavy equipment after dark. The noise carries too far and the operators make mistakes. By 11, the camp's mostly quiet. 2 or 3 men walking the perimeter, but they're not military about it." She paused. "They're mining company guards. They're used to keeping drunks from stealing equipment, not to anything like this." "How many total in the camp at night?" "Maybe 15, most of them sleeping." "And Gideon would be in the holding room." Evelyn looked at the envelope drawing. Gideon had marked a single structure near the back of the camp, a stone building originally used for equipment storage, later converted. He'd labeled it lockup in his small handwriting, which suggested he'd been told about it or seen it used before she arrived. 1 guard on that, or 2? "I don't know," Margaret said. 1, I'd guess. They're not expecting trouble." "They should be," Hurst said. He'd been quiet through most of this, reading the envelope drawing, and now he looked up. "I need to be clear about my authority here. The document I'm carrying authorizes protective action in cases of unlawful detention. If we go up there tonight and it goes wrong, you cite your authority and I take responsibility for the rest," Evelyn said. "That's not how authority works." "Deputy Hurst?" She looked at him. "A man is being held illegally in a mining camp by a company under federal investigation. You have a document that says you can act. The marshals are 4 days away. Are we going to discuss the administrative implications of acting, or are we going to act?" He looked at the drawing. He looked at Evelyn. "You've done this before?" he asked. "No." "You're very calm for someone who hasn't done this before." "I'm not calm. I've just decided that the fear's going to have to wait its turn." She turned back to the drawing. "Here's what I need from you, your badge and your authority, so that if we're stopped before we reach the holding room, we have legal standing, and your rifle. You know how to use a rifle? Point and pull. I know the principle." She met his eyes. "I'd rather not use it. I'd rather walk in and walk out without a single shot. But I want to have it." Hurst sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands in the manner of someone recalibrating their expectations of the evening. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way on the approach, slow and quiet. Nobody does anything sudden." Agreed. They needed 2 more people, not for force. The point was not to be a force. The point was to be a fact, official and calm and harder to dismiss than a lone woman and a young deputy. Evelyn went to Frank Donahue because Frank had been holding the community together for the past 4 days, and because he had the specific credibility of someone who had been pushed past his own fear and come out the other side still standing. Frank said yes before she finished asking. She went to Ira Flood next, the mine worker who'd signed a statement, who'd been with Consolidated long enough to know the layout of their operations better than anyone outside the company. She found him at the Henderson place, where he'd been bunking since putting his name on paper made his own boarding situation uncertain. "I know that camp?" Ira said. He was sitting at the Hendersons' kitchen table with a mug of coffee and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to need what he knew. "I worked it for 2 years before they moved me to the primary shaft. There's a way in through the equipment yard that the perimeter walk doesn't cover. South side between the fuel shed and the ore processing building. Gap in the fence where they removed a section to bring in a new conveyor. I don't think they ever replaced it properly. Show me on the drawing." He looked at the envelope. He pointed. "There. And the holding room is on the north wall of the main structure, not the back. Gideon drew this from the approach, so his orientations flipped. The lockup is here." She updated the drawing. "Will you come?" Ira looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands. He was a man in his 40s who had spent most of his adult life working for a company that had just spent 2 years reminding him how little it valued him, and the question of whether he would come into their camp at night with a bookkeeper and a federal deputy was clearly working its way through several layers of very reasonable self-preservation. "I'll come," he said, "but I want it on record that I'm coming voluntarily and as a cooperative witness to a federal action. Deputy Hurst can document that." Good. They left at 10:30, when the valley was fully dark, and the temperature had dropped into the range that made the snow creak underfoot. 5 of them. Evelyn, Hurst, Frank Donahue, Ira Flood, and Warren Kellogg, who had appeared at Halloran's at 9 o'clock without being asked, and said simply that he was coming, and Evelyn hadn't argued it because Warren Kellogg was a large, steady man, and his presence communicated something that no amount of words would. The North Ridge Road was 2 miles from the settlement. They went mostly silent, Ira in the lead because he knew the terrain, Hurst beside Evelyn with the rifle across his back and the federal document in his coat. Frank walked with the particular focus of a man who is not quite sure what he's doing, but is committed to it entirely. Warren walked the way Warren always walked, like he weighed more than the situation did. The camp appeared through the trees as a cluster of lit windows and the smell of coal smoke and the distant sound of a generator running somewhere on the far side of the structures. Larger than the drawing suggested, or maybe just more present than a drawing could convey. The gate was on the east side, lantern-lit, with one man stationed there in a coat that wasn't warm enough for the temperature, judging by the way he was moving. Ira took them around to the south, through a pine stand that brought them parallel to the fence line. He was right about the gap, a section of fencing that had been replaced with a rope and post arrangement during some modification, never properly fixed, loose enough that a person could push through with care. They went through one at a time. Evelyn's coat caught on the wire and she worked it free without sound. Inside the fence, the camp had a different character. The scale of it more apparent, the structures close together and utilitarian, the ground between them packed dirt that had frozen into ridges. Ira moved through it with the confidence of someone reading a familiar map, staying in the shadow between the fuel shed and the processing building, angling north. The holding room was a stone structure attached to the main operations building, just as Ira had corrected it. One window, barred. A heavy door with an exterior bolt and a padlock. One guard, a man seated on a crate outside the door with his rifle across his knees and his chin at the angle of someone fighting sleep in the cold. Hurst touched Evelyn's arm. She stopped. They watched. The perimeter patrol walked past at a distance of maybe 40 feet, moving east to west, not looking their direction. When he was past, Hurst stepped forward into the light from the guard's lantern, his badge in his hand. "Federal deputy," he said quietly but clearly. "Don't reach for the rifle." The guard's chin came up fast. His hands moved toward the rifle by reflex, then stopped when they registered the badge and, Evelyn thought, the expression on Hurst's face, which was the very specific expression of someone who is not bluffing and would prefer not to escalate. "I have a federal document authorizing inspection of this facility and the immediate release of any persons detained without legal authority." Hurst kept his voice at a volume that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate position. "The man in that room, what's his name?" The guard blinked. "Cross, Gideon Cross." "Is he injured?" A pause. "No, they haven't. No." "Open the lock." Another pause, longer. The guard looked at the badge. He looked at Evelyn and Frank and Warren and Ira. standing there in the dark like a fact he hadn't been prepared for. He looked back at Hurst. "I'll need to wake the supervisor." "Open the lock," Hurst said again. Same tone, same quiet. "Your supervisor can speak with Commissioner Arthur Price of the Federal Land Office when he arrives in 4 days. Right now, open the lock." The guard opened the lock. The bolt drew back. The door swung in on a dark interior that smelled of stone and cold, and the specific closeness of a space without ventilation. Evelyn went in first. She had brought a lantern. She held it up, and the light found Gideon in the far corner of the room, sitting on the floor with his back against the stone wall, his knees up, his coat still on, which meant they hadn't taken it, which meant it hadn't gotten all the way to physical. He had 5 days of beard and a cut on his lower lip that had dried dark, and a stillness about him that was different from his usual stillness. Not calm, but the absence of the energy required to be anything. He looked at the lantern. He looked at her face behind it. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was rough. "Can you walk?" "Yes." He started getting up. His legs took a moment to respond, cold and cramped from the floor, and she stepped forward and got a hand under his arm, and he let her, which told her more than anything about the past 5 days. "The marshals are 4 days out," she said quietly, close to him. "Price is coming himself. The evidence is intact. The case is filed." He got his feet under him, straightened. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just forgotten the specifics of him in the 11 days she'd been gone. "You did it," he said. "We did it. Come on." They came out of the holding room and the guard was still there, not having moved, watching Hurst with an expression of someone doing rapid calculations about employment and loyalty and self-interest. Warren Kellogg looked at the guard with a gaze of absolute neutral appraisal that apparently resolved those calculations in a useful direction, because the guard sat back down on his crate and did not reach for his rifle. They moved back through the camp the way they'd come in. The perimeter patrol crossed at a distance again, going the other direction. Ira led them through the fence gap, holding the wire back for Gideon, who moved stiffly but steadily. In the pine trees, out of sight of the camp's lights, Frank Donahue put his hand on Gideon's shoulder for a moment and didn't say anything. Gideon looked at him and nodded once. That was the whole of it. They walked back down the ridge road in the dark, and it was not until they were a full half-mile from the camp that Evelyn's hands started shaking, which she'd been expecting and which she allowed for about 90 seconds before she made them stop. The camp would know by morning. That was the arithmetic she'd done before they went in and accepted as the cost. Consolidated would know Gideon was gone, would know a federal deputy had been involved, would know the walls were closing. What they did with that knowledge was the variable she couldn't control. What she could do was make the next 18 hours count. At Halloran's, Margaret had coffee and food, and the particular quiet efficiency of a woman who had been prepared for multiple outcomes and was relieved by this one. Gideon ate without talking, which was fine. He needed to eat, and he was the kind of man who processed things privately before he spoke about them. Hurst wrote up the incident report at the kitchen table. What time, what authority, what was found, who was released. In triplicate, in the methodical handwriting of someone who had learned to document things before he had any idea what documentation was for. Evelyn, while this happened, went through her options. Consolidated would move against the community now. They'd been exposed. A federal deputy had been in their camp, had released their leverage, had documented the unlawful detention. Harlan Voss was too controlled to panic, but he was also too controlled to do nothing. The question was what form the response would take. Burning property was one option. They'd done it before. But burning property with a federal deputy in the valley created a different level of exposure than burning it in a valley no one in authority was looking at. Economic pressure was another. Calling in supply debts, cutting off coal delivery in the last weeks of winter. The kind of slow squeeze that didn't show up as a crime but cost people terribly. Harder to act against immediately, but deeply damaging. The third option was the most dangerous, moving against the documentation directly. Margaret's packet. Whatever copies people had kept in their own homes. "Margaret," Evelyn said, "the duplicate packet." "I moved it 3 days ago," Margaret said without turning from the stove. "It's not here." "Where is it?" "Agnes Donahue's root cellar, under the second shelf, behind the preserves." She turned around. "I had a feeling." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. You were managing things while I was gone. Somebody had to. Margaret set a mug of coffee in front of her. The Kellogg's have been keeping copies of their own statements at their daughter's place on the south side, which is outside the main valley and therefore less obvious. Ruth Patton, the widow from the assay office, she made her own copies and gave them to the minister in Reedsville when she sent her nephew through for supplies 2 weeks ago. Ruth sent documents to Reedsville? Ruth is not as fragile as she looks, Margaret said simply. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The thing she'd been building, the case, the documentation, the careful architecture of evidence, had been distributed, copied, dispersed into the community in ways she hadn't known about. The people she'd been helping had been helping themselves, had been watching what she was doing and understanding it and taking their own pieces of it into their own hands. She thought about what Gideon had said back at the beginning. That's the thing about what Consolidated does. It makes every family think their problem is a personal failing. She thought about Warren Kellogg standing outside the mine camp for 2 hours after Gideon was taken, saying nothing, just standing there so they'd know someone was watching. Across the kitchen, Gideon had finished eating and was sitting with his coffee and looking at the table in the specific way that meant he was thinking rather than being absent. His lip was split and his coat was dirty, and he had 5 days of exhaustion in him that sleep would begin to address, but not immediately cure. He looked up and caught her looking. "Tell me what happened," he said. "From Reedsville." She told him, all of it. Price and the 3-hour meeting, Dorothea Marsh and the legal precedents, Silas Vane at the newspaper, the telegram from Margaret, the ride back through the mountains, the document Hearst carried. She told it plainly and in order, the way she'd learned to tell things when they mattered. He listened the same way, completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You made an action riskier," he said, Dorothea Marsh's phrase. "Smart woman." "Yes." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "Voss will know by now. About the deputy, about Price coming. He's not going to wait quietly for 4 days." "I know. He'll want to show this valley that federal interest or not, Consolidated is the lasting reality and the government is temporary." He said it without heat, an analysis, not a fear. He's going to make an example, probably property. He'll want it to look like an accident or a natural consequence, not a reprisal. Who does he go after? Someone who can't fight back and whose loss sends a message. Gideon looked at the table. The Whitfields. She thought of Joel and Sarah Whitfield, the baby, the failing cattle operation, Joel's dismissal from the supply crew, the careful ambiguity that made it unprovable. Why the Whitfields specifically? Because Joel signed a statement, because he's young and hasn't got resources to rebuild if they hit him, and because the Whitfields are liked in this valley. Making an example of someone liked sends a bigger message than making an example of someone already on the margins. He looked at her. "It's what I'd do, if I were Voss." "Can we move them?" "To where?" "Kellogg's have a daughter on the south side. If we get the Whitfields out tonight—" "They won't go," Gideon said. "Joel won't. He's been running for 2 years. He stopped running the day he signed that paper." He was quiet for a moment. "But we can be there." "You need to rest." "I've been resting for 5 days in a stone room." He set the mug down. "I'll rest when this is over." She looked at him across the kitchen table. He looked back. His eyes were tired but not empty. There was something in them that had survived 5 days in that room, the same thing that had survived the fire and the year before the fire, when he'd watched his wife fade from something the doctors couldn't name or stop. "All right," she said. "We go to the Whitfields." They went in 2 groups, taking separate routes, which Hearst had suggested as standard practice when you expected to be watched. Evelyn and Gideon took the longer road, which brought them to the Whitfield property through the back pasture. The night was clear and cold, a half moon giving enough light to navigate by without a lantern if you moved carefully. "How bad was it?" she said as they walked. Not a question exactly, more an opening. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "First 2 days weren't bad. Voss came himself. Sat across from me in that room like we were having a business meeting. Very reasonable. He wanted 2 things, a signed statement that I had no evidence of any criminal activity by Consolidated, and a deed transfer for the Eastern Ridge land." He paused. I told him I didn't have any documents to sign because you'd taken everything to the Capitol. What did he say? He said that was convenient. Then he said I could sit there until I changed my mind or until you came back empty-handed, whichever came first. A pause. He knew you'd gone to the Capitol. He knew you were trying to build a case. He just didn't believe it would amount to anything. Because no one ever made it amount to anything before. Because no one ever made it. He walked for a moment in the snow. After the second day, Voss stopped coming. They just left me in the room. That was the harder part. She understood what he meant. The isolation, the not knowing, the slow pressure of silence that asks you to fill it with doubt. I wasn't coming back empty-handed, she said. I know. He said it simply, like a thing that had been decided and held through 5 days of a stone room and hadn't wavered. I knew. They reached the Whitfield property and found it dark and quiet. The house shuttered, the cattle in the small barn, no sign of movement. Frank Donahue and Warren Kellogg were already there, having taken the direct road, standing in the tree line at the edge of the property, with the patience of people who'd been doing this long enough to be still. Anything? Evelyn said quietly. Not yet, Frank said. They settled in to wait. This was the part no one liked. The waiting without knowing, the cold and the quiet, and the possibility that nothing happened, and they stood in a dark field all night for nothing, which was the best possible outcome, and also the most uncomfortable one. Gideon stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of him without any of it needing to be said. At 2 a.m, approximately, 3 riders came down the North Road at a pace that was not casual. They turned off the North Road before the Whitfield gate, came through the upper pasture. They were trying to be quiet about it, and mostly succeeding, but 3 horses on frozen ground at night make a certain amount of sound that you can't fully eliminate. Warren Kellogg stepped out of the tree line. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply stepped into the open, where the moonlight caught him, and stood there. 300 pounds of deliberate, unignorable fact. The rider stopped. From the tree line, Hirsch stepped forward and held up his badge. It caught the moonlight the way he'd probably calculated it would when he positioned himself. "Federal deputy," he said. "This property is under federal protection. Identify yourselves." A silence. The 3 riders were still. No one reaching for anything, no one retreating. Just stopped, like men who have encountered something they hadn't prepared for and are working out the math. "We're headed to Birch Crossing," one of them said finally. It was a voice that was trying to be casual and not quite getting there. "Birch Crossing's east," Gideon said from the other side. He'd moved without Evelyn hearing him, which was either remarkable or she'd been watching the riders and not him. He was standing at the edge of the upper pasture, on the far side from Hearst, which meant the riders had federal authority on one side and a large, familiar, unhappy rancher on the other. "North Road doesn't go to Birch Crossing." Another silence. "Turn around," Hearst said. "Tell whoever sent you that this property is documented and watched, and that Commissioner Price of the Federal Land Office arrives in 3 days. Anything that happens to any property in this valley between now and then will be treated as obstruction of a federal proceeding." He said it with the authority of the document in his coat and the badge in his hand and 23 years of age and the very specific quality of someone who has decided, perhaps more recently than he'd admit, that this is what the job is actually for. The riders turned around. They were gone in 2 minutes, back up the North Road, at a pace that was faster than they'd arrived. Frank let out a long breath. Warren turned and walked back to the tree line without ceremony. Gideon came back to stand beside Evelyn. "That's not the end of it," he said. "No, but it's tonight handled." They stayed until first light, taking turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts against the base of a cottonwood at the edge of the property. Nothing else came. The Whitfield house remained dark and intact, and Sarah Whitfield, who opened the door at dawn to find 5 people in her front pasture, looked at them for a moment and then said she was going to make coffee, which struck Evelyn as the entirely correct response to the situation. The next 3 days were the kind that age people. Consolidated did not attack any property directly. Voss was too careful for that now, with Hearst's incident report filed and Price on the road. Instead, they applied pressure the way they knew best: economic, quiet, deniable. Coal deliveries to 3 businesses stopped without notice or explanation. The supply wagon that normally brought provisions to the valley's general store arrived empty, the driver citing a loading error at the depot that no one believed. A rumor circulated, spread through the valley in a way that had Consolidated's fingerprints all over it, that the federal investigation would tie up Bloodstone's commerce for years, and that the smart move was to sell out to Consolidated now, before the trouble got worse. Evelyn spent those 3 days in motion, going from family to family with the same message: hold. The Marshalls were coming. Price was coming. Hold for 3 days. Most of them held. The Kellogg's held. The Donahues held. Ira Flood and Theo Birch, the two mine workers who'd been most exposed, moved temporarily into Halloran's, where Margaret charged them a reasonable rate and did not ask questions. Ruth Patton, who Evelyn had thought was close to leaving the valley, sent a message saying she'd decided she was staying. 2 families did take Consolidated's offer. The Meekers, who had 3 children and debt they couldn't carry, sold their grazing rights for less than value and left the valley. Evelyn did not blame them. She thought of them sometimes. The particular calculation of a family with children where principle and survival arrive at different answers. And she held it without judgment, because judgment was easy from a position of not having 3 children and debt. Gideon was the one who held the community together in those 3 days, in the way that only he could. Not through speeches or urgency, but through presence. He went where people were frightened and sat with them. He helped the Whitfields with their barn repairs during the day, because the work was there and Joel needed the company. He showed up at Halloran's each evening and ate with whoever was there and talked about practical things: the spring planting, the road conditions, the price of beef at the Reedsville market. And the normality of it was its own kind of reassurance. This is still the valley. We are still here. She watched him do it and thought, this is what he would have done all along if they'd had a community to do it in. If the community hadn't been systematically persuaded that there was no point in trying. On the 3rd day, Commissioner Price rode into Bloodstone Valley with 2 federal marshals and Silas Vane from the Harding City Territorial Record, which had not been part of the original arrangement, but which Price had apparently decided was tactically useful. A journalist present meant a record that served everyone's interest in transparency. Price was different than he'd been in his office. Still careful, still precise, but with a quality she hadn't seen in the Capitol. A forward-facing attention, like a man who has spent 20 years being cautious and has just decided that caution has a cost. He met Evelyn at Halloran's. He looked at Gideon, assessed the cut lip and the 5 days' story behind it, and said, "You're cross." "That's right," Gideon said. "Your land deed is confirmed intact at the records office. The January inquiry by Consolidated's legal representative is documented." He held out a formal envelope. "That's a notice of confirmed ownership, in case they told you otherwise." Gideon took it. He held it for a moment in a way that wasn't performing anything. Just a man holding something he'd been afraid had been taken. "Thank you," he said. Price turned to Evelyn. "The Marshalls are going to the mine camp this morning. I'd like you with me. You know this valley better than any of us." "I know." "There may be resistance from Voss. He has lawyers and he'll use them." "I know that too." She met his eyes. "The evidence is solid, every piece of it. Whatever his lawyers throw at it, the evidence holds." Price nodded. "Then let's go." The confrontation at the mine camp was not what Evelyn had imagined in her more dramatic moments. Harlan Voss, when confronted by Commissioner Price, 2 federal marshals, a documented case of unlawful detention, and 14 years of charter violation evidence, did not rage. He did not threaten. He requested his lawyers, which was his right, and he sat very still with the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the position he's been defending has collapsed. He looked, Evelyn thought, like the numbers at the end of a ledger when they finally tell the truth. His lawyers arrived from wherever they'd been waiting. In Reedsville, it turned out, which suggested Voss had anticipated something and had prepared, but had not prepared for what actually came. They were good lawyers, she could see that, and they challenged 3 of the rate comparison documents on evidentiary grounds and raised questions about 2 of the sworn statements. Price heard them out. Then he put the mine worker testimonies on the table. Ira Flood's, Theo Birch's, the 3rd man whose name was Clem Shaughnessy, who had worked in the mine operation for 7 years and had seen enough to write 4 pages of careful, specific detail. Then he put the pricing records. Then he put the land deed inquiry documentation from Mrs. Cathcart. Then, last, he put Deputy Hurst's incident report from the night Gideon was released. The lawyers went quiet. Unlawful detention of a private citizen, Price said, in the tone of someone reading items from a list. Destruction of private property, specifically the Cross Ranch fire, for which we now have a witness placing your field supervisor at the property 3 weeks prior. Systematic pricing fraud in violation of Charter Section 14, Clause B, which requires fair and non-discriminatory supply terms to all regional customers. Labor violations, including retaliatory dismissal of workers who raise safety concerns, documented by 3 separate testimonies. He looked at Voss. This is not a negotiation, Mr. Voss. These marshals are here to execute an arrest warrant for you and for Dillard Cutter. Your company's operational charter is suspended pending the outcome of the federal proceeding. Voss said nothing. He looked at his lawyers. One of them shook his head very slightly. Voss stood and put his coat on. He did it with the same composed precision he'd brought to every conversation Evelyn had seen him in, and she found herself thinking that whatever else he was not a man who broke in the open. He would break privately, somewhere, sometime, but not here. He walked out with the marshals. She stood in the operations building doorway and watched them cross the camp yard, and felt nothing in particular, which surprised her a little. She'd thought there would be more feeling, more release, but the thing she mostly felt was tired, and underneath the tired was something quieter and harder to name. Gideon appeared beside her. He'd come with them. She'd tried to suggest he stay in the valley, and he'd looked at her with the expression that meant he was not going to stay in the valley. "That's it?" he said. "That's the beginning of it," she said. "Lawyers and proceedings, and probably 2 years of arguments about what the evidence proves. But yes, that's the beginning. You thought it would feel different." She looked at him. "Did I say that?" "You didn't have to." He looked out at the camp yard where the marshals had reached the gate with Voss between them. "It always feels different than you expect. The moment when the thing you've been working toward actually happens. It's never the shape you imagined." "How does it feel to you?" He thought about it. "Like the fire on the eastern ridge finally means something other than a loss," he said. She absorbed that quietly. "The valley still needs to rebuild," she said. "Even with Consolidated's charter suspended, the supply chains are disrupted. The coal deliveries have stopped. 3 businesses are in debt from the winter rates. It's not over when Voss walks out the gate." "No," he agreed. "It's not. That's going to take time. Years, maybe." "I know. And someone's going to have to be here for it. Not just holding on, but actually building. Roads that work. Fair pricing. Businesses that can get ahead instead of just surviving." Gideon looked at her. He had that double attentive quality. Listening to more than one thing. "You thinking about leaving?" She looked out at the valley below them. The settlement in the white distance. The smoke rising from the chimneys. The Donahue place and the Kellogg place and Halloran's, where Margaret was probably reorganizing her shelves in the way she reorganized things when she was pleased but didn't want to say so. She thought about Harold Fenwick's letter, which she'd answered 2 months ago. About the life she'd planned, the steady habits and fair dealing, the practical arrangement that had seemed at the time like the best she could reasonably ask for. She had stopped being reasonable somewhere around the 6th week of a winter storm in a valley that wasn't on her map. She wasn't sure she could go back to it. "No," she said. "I'm not thinking about leaving." Something in his face changed, not dramatically, the way nothing about Gideon was dramatic, just the particular shift of someone who has been holding a thing carefully for a long time and has been told now that he can set it down. "Good," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The moment was not polished or particularly eloquent, and neither of them reached for it to make it more than it was, because it was already everything it needed to be. "The valley needs a working road commission," she said. He almost smiled. "I know. And a cooperative supply arrangement that pools purchasing power across all the valley businesses. Also know that. And someone needs to sit down with the Whitfields and work out a realistic debt restructuring, because Joel's going to bury himself in pride about it if someone doesn't." "Evelyn," she stopped. "That list is going to keep for 1 day," he said. "Just one." She looked at the valley below them, at the smoke from the chimneys and the white ridgelines and the thin spring sun doing its best with the light it had. She thought about the girl who'd gotten off a stagecoach in a blizzard with a broken latched carpet bag and $43, who'd been so certain her future was 200 miles west, and had been so completely wrong in the most useful way a person can be wrong. "All right," she said, "one day." They walked back down the ridge road together, into the valley, with the morning opening around them the way mornings in mountain country do. Slowly, then all at once. The one day Gideon asked for turned into 3, which was the closest either of them came to rest for a long time afterward. Price stayed in the valley for a week, conducting formal interviews and processing the documentation that Evelyn had built. He worked with a methodical seriousness that she respected, and he did not cut corners, which was the main thing she'd been worried about. That the capital's appetite for a clean resolution would lead someone to accept a partial accounting of Consolidated's damage and call it finished. Price did not do that. He went through every family's records, every rate comparison, every sworn statement, and he built the federal case with the same layered thoroughness she'd used to build the evidentiary one. Silas Vane from the Territorial Record spent 4 days in Bloodstone interviewing people, and the piece he wrote ran across 2 full pages of the paper. He got the pricing differentials right, and he got the human scale of it right. Not in a way that dramatized it falsely, but in a way that made clear what 8 years of systematic extraction had actually cost 31 families in time, in hope, in the small specific losses that don't appear in any ledger. He quoted Frank Donahue. He quoted Agnes. He quoted Warren Kellogg, whose words on the page had the same measured weight as his presence in person. He did not quote Evelyn, per her request. She had no interest in being the story. Dillard Cutter was arrested at the mine camp the same morning as Voss, on the strength of Pete Alderman's testimony and the dated record of his visit to the Cross property. He was a harder case legally than Voss. The connection between his visit and the fire required inference that the lawyers would contest, but Price was confident the arson charge would hold when combined with the pattern evidence. Evelyn thought he was probably right, and she thought about Gideon's land deed in the records office and the blue glass bottle that had held wildflowers, and she felt something complicated and true that she did not try to simplify. The federal proceeding against Consolidated Rock and Mineral took 14 months. During those 14 months, the valley did what Evelyn had predicted it would need to do. It rebuilt, imperfectly and not without argument, in the way that real things are built. Chet. The first serious fight was about coal. With Consolidated's charter suspended, the supply chain that had fed the valley's heating and mining operations collapsed almost immediately. It was April by then, past the worst of winter, but not past the need for heat entirely, and the smaller operations that had depended on Consolidated's stockpile had nothing to draw from. Evelyn spent 2 weeks negotiating a cooperative purchasing arrangement with a supply company out of Reedsville, a company that had no existing relationship with any Bloodstone business, which was the point, and whose rates were fair in the flat, uninterested way of a company that didn't care about leverage because it had enough business elsewhere to survive losing any single customer. Getting the valley's businesses to agree to pool their purchasing was harder than getting the supply deal itself. Warren Kellogg didn't trust collective arrangements. He'd seen them fail in other contexts, and he had the long memory of a man who'd been burned before, not literally, but financially. Joel Whitfield was suspicious that the larger operations would dominate the arrangement at the expense of smaller ones, which was a reasonable concern that Evelyn addressed by building a weighted voting structure into the cooperative's charter that gave no single member more than 20% of the vote, regardless of purchase volume. They argued about it for 3 weeks in Margaret's front room, which became by informal agreement the place where the valley's community business happened. Margaret providing coffee and the occasional pointed observation from the kitchen doorway, and otherwise leaving them to work it out. "You're all behaving," Evelyn said, at one particularly stuck meeting, "as if the worst thing that could happen is this arrangement failing. The worst thing that could happen already happened, and you survived it. This is just numbers." Warren Kellogg looked at her for a long moment. "You are not a comforting woman," he said. "I'm a useful one," she said. "Is there a difference on the table or not?" They signed the cooperative charter that evening. 11 businesses initially. By autumn, 19 petites. Gideon rebuilt on the eastern ridge. Not the same house. The stone foundation was still there, but he'd decided the layout hadn't worked well, which was a practical reason that sat on top of several other reasons he didn't articulate and didn't need to. He started in May with timber he'd sourced through the cooperative arrangement, and Pete Alderman came back from the McCready operation to help, And Frank Donahue showed up on the first Saturday with 3 of his neighbors and a willingness to work that had less to do with the specific house and more to do with the specific principle of a man rebuilding what had been taken from him. Evelyn went up to the Ridge on a Saturday in June with sandwiches from Margaret's kitchen and the deed documentation in an envelope because she'd had it copied and certified one more time just to be thorough, and because she needed an excuse to be on the Ridge that wasn't simply wanting to be on the Ridge. The house was framed by then. You could see the shape of it, where the rooms would be, how it would sit in relation to the tree line, the window placement that would catch the morning light. "You put the kitchen on the south side," she said. "Better light for the morning." He took the envelope, looked at it, put it in his coat pocket without opening it. He already knew what was in it. "Margaret send the sandwiches, or did you make those yourself?" "Margaret? She's better at it than I am." "That's honest. I'm a bookkeeper. I cook adequately, as previously established." He almost smiled, the way he almost smiled at things. The expression living at the edge of his face rather than the center of it. "I've been thinking about the Valley's road commission." "Have you?" "Someone should chair it who knows what they're doing administratively. Someone who's good at documentation and doesn't get pushed around." She looked at him. "You're offering me a road commission. I'm suggesting the Valley needs one and that you're the logical choice to organize it." "That's not a small thing, Gideon. A road commission means surveying, funding, negotiating with the territorial government for maintenance contracts. I know what it means." "You'd be on it too, I assume." "I'd be on it. And the cooperative board." "Also, yes." She looked at the framed house, the south-facing kitchen windows, the morning light he'd planned for. "I'll need an office," she said. "A real one, not Margaret's kitchen table. There's a space above the assay building that Ruth's been trying to rent for 2 years." "I know. I looked at it in February." She paused. "It needs new floorboards." "I can put in new floorboards." She looked at him. He looked at her. The June air was warm in a way that Bloodstone Valley's air had not been, in her experience, warm, and the mountains around them were the particular green of early summer, and nothing about the moment was arranged or pretty in the way moments in stories are sometimes arranged to be. Her hair was coming loose from its pins. He had sawdust on his coat. There were 16 things on her working list that needed attention before the end of the week. "Yes," she said. "To the office or the road commission?" "To all of it," she said. "Obviously." The federal verdict on Consolidated came in the following spring. Harlan Voss received a 5-year sentence and a personal fine that represented a significant fraction of his accumulated earnings from the Valley's operations. Dillard Cutter received 7 years. The arson charge had held, as Price predicted, when the pattern evidence was laid alongside Pete Alderman's testimony. The company itself was dissolved as a licensed entity in the territory. Its assets seized and put into a restitution fund that the court divided among the families and businesses documented as having been defrauded over the 8-year period. The restitution wasn't everything. It never was. The Meekers, who had already sold and left the Valley, received a payment that covered their losses, but not the life they'd had to leave behind, and no payment could cover that anyway. Several businesses that had been weakened past recovery over the 8 years had already closed before the verdict, not from the last year's disruption, but from the long, slow bleed of Consolidated's pricing strategy working as intended. The money helped, and money helping is not the same as money fixing. Evelyn sat with this for a long time. She sat with it the evening the verdict came through, when the Valley held something that felt like celebration but was quieter than celebration. People gathered at Halloran's and at the Donahue place and at the Kellogg farm, and there was food and there was relief and there was the specific exhaustion of people who have been holding tension for 14 months and have just been told they can stop. She sat with the knowledge that 31 families had gotten something back, and some of them had gotten back something close to what they'd lost, and the Meekers were in a different town and 2 other families had left, and none of that was undone by the verdict. She did not think the world was fair. She had stopped thinking that sometime in her 20s and had not started again. What she thought was that fairness was not a condition you inherited, but a direction you moved in, and that the movement mattered even when the destination was always further than you'd gotten. The Valley had moved. That was what the 14 months had been. Not a restoration. You couldn't restore what 8 years had taken, but a movement in a different direction, away from the particular paralysis of people who have been taught, systematically, that resistance is pointless. Warren Kellogg's timber operation expanded in the second year, freed from the supply rate that had kept it from growing. He hired 2 men he'd have had to turn away before. He was gruff about it, the way Warren was gruff about things that mattered to him. But Evelyn saw him at the cooperative board meeting that autumn with the accounts spread in front of him, and his finger on the column that showed the year-over-year difference. And his expression had the specific quality of a man finally seen the proof of something he'd believed but hadn't been able to demonstrate. The Whitfields stabilized. Joel was the kind of man who'd never quite stopped being cautious about money. The previous years had put that in him, and some things don't come out. But the cattle operation found its footing, and the baby became a toddler and then a child who ran through the boarding house on Sunday visits, while Sarah apologized to Margaret, and Margaret said she didn't mind, which was not true, but was kind. Ira Flood and Theo Birch both found work with the new mining operation that came into the valley 2 years after Consolidated's dissolution. A smaller company, family-owned, that had read Silas Vane's article in the Territorial Record and understood that the valley was paying attention to how a mining company behaved. The rates they charged were not charitable, but they were consistent and documented, and the same for everyone, which was the point. Ruth Patton kept the assay office open. She was, as Margaret had said, not as fragile as she looked. The office above the assay building had good floorboards by the time Evelyn moved in, and a south-facing window that caught the afternoon light, and 2 filing cabinets that she'd sourced from a business closure in Reedsville at a reasonable price. She put her father's compass on the windowsill, where it caught the light occasionally and served no practical function, and had no place being there except that it was hers. The road commission turned out to be exactly the kind of work she was suited for and did not find pleasant, which she had expected. It involved persuading people to spend money on things they couldn't see the immediate benefit of, and navigating territorial funding processes that had been designed by people with no apparent interest in making them navigable, and sitting through meetings where men who had decided they didn't trust the process spent significant time explaining why the process shouldn't be trusted. She got through those meetings by being the person in the room who had read the most documents and losing her patience no more than twice per meeting, which was the sustainable rate. Gideon chaired the Valley's Land Rights Committee, which handled the legal aftermath of Consolidated's dissolution, the properties that had been purchased under duress, the grazing rights that had been transferred under threat, the recorded agreements that the court reviewed and in several cases unwound. He was methodical at it, which she'd expected, and patient in the particular way of someone who understands that legal processes move on their own time and fighting that is wasted energy. He went to the Capitol twice to work with Price's office on specific cases, and both times she sent the trip feeling something she identified honestly as wanting him back, which was a straightforward feeling that she no longer spent much time being awkward about. They were married the 2nd October, in the kind of ceremony that reflected them accurately. Brief, practical. Attended by most of the valley because Margaret told everyone in Margaret's information network was, by that point, essentially the valley's communication infrastructure. Frank Donahue cried, which surprised everyone, including Frank. Warren Kellogg shook Gideon's hand for a long time without saying anything, which was, for Warren, the equivalent of a speech. Margaret made the food. It was good. Margaret's food was always good. Evelyn wore the dress she'd arrived in Bloodstone Valley with, which had been mended twice and let out at the waist, and was entirely inappropriate for the occasion by the standards of most occasions, and she wore it because she wanted to, and because no one in Bloodstone Valley was going to tell her otherwise. Years pass the way years do in places that are working. Not quickly, but not wastefully. Each year left something behind that the next year built on, which is the only kind of progress that lasts. The Road Commission's first project was the Main Valley Road, which had been maintained inconsistently for a decade and showed it. The second was a connecting road to the south that opened trade routes that had been impossible in bad weather. The third was a schoolhouse, which was technically not a road project, but which the commission funded after Evelyn made the argument that connectivity was not only physical, and which she made in a meeting that lasted 3 hours and ended with Warren Kellogg, who had been the most resistant, saying that she should have just said it was for the children and saved them all the trouble. And Evelyn saying she hadn't wanted to manipulate him, and Warren saying that sometimes manipulation was efficient and she should consider it. She considered it. She did not generally adopt it, but she considered it. The schoolhouse opened in the Valley's 4th year post-Consolidated. The teacher they hired was a young woman from Harding City who arrived by stage, a good stage connection now, running twice a week, with 2 trunks of books and the particular energy of someone who has found the right work and knows it. She was, Evelyn thought, not unlike herself at a certain age, clear-eyed and underestimated and absolutely certain of what she intended to accomplish. Evelyn gave her Margaret's kitchen table when Margaret finally got a new one because the young teacher was living in the room above the schoolhouse with no furniture to speak of, and because the table had been where Bloodstone Valley's future had been planned, and it seemed right that it go somewhere futures were still being made. Margaret accepted this transfer with a comment about sentimentality that was itself sentimental, and Evelyn chose not to point that out. There is a thing that happens in communities that have been through something, not immediately, not even in the first few years, but later, when enough time has passed that people begin to tell stories about what happened, and the stories start to smooth out the rough parts and turn the difficult people into simpler ones. The fear becomes less sharp in the retelling. The moments of genuine doubt, the Meekers leaving, the 2 weeks when no one was sure whether to believe the marshals were actually coming, the night in the mine camp when Evelyn's hand shook for 90 seconds in the pine trees, those parts get compressed or dropped entirely. What's left is a cleaner narrative than what actually occurred. She noticed this happening in Bloodstone Valley and found it necessary and irritating in roughly equal measure. Necessary because communities need stories they can hold. The full complexity of what happened, the fear that had been rational, the cooperation that had come slowly and imperfectly, the families who hadn't stayed, was too much weight to carry into every future conversation. People needed a version they could pass to their children. Irritating because the version being passed was, in certain respects, wrong in ways that mattered. The version made it sound as if the outcome had been more inevitable than it was, as if the people of Bloodstone Valley had simply needed someone to come along and show them what they were capable of, when the truth was they'd always been capable of it. They'd been systematically prevented from exercising it, which was different. The capability had been there in Agnes Donahue going house to house, in Warren standing outside the mine camp for 2 hours, in Margaret moving the packet to the root cellar before anyone asked her to, in Ruth Patton sending documents to Reedsville with her nephew. Those were not people who needed to be shown what they were capable of. Those were people who had been operating under conditions deliberately designed to make capability useless, and the conditions had changed. That distinction mattered to her. It mattered because the lesson people drew from what had happened would shape how they behaved when the next version of it appeared. And it would appear in some form because the forces that had created Consolidated were not unique to Consolidated. They were the forces of concentrated power meeting dispersed vulnerability, and they would find the Valley again if the Valley gave them the opportunity. So she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She'd had options, had turned them down. A position in Harding City that Price's office had offered her after the verdict, doing exactly the kind of investigative documentation work she'd done in Bloodstone, for more money and in a larger arena. She'd considered it seriously for about a week, and then she'd thought about the schoolhouse they hadn't built yet and the road to the south that still wasn't passable in mud season. And she'd written a polite refusal and gone back to the commission meeting she was already late for. She stayed because the work was here, and because Gideon was here, and because, more than either of those things, she'd found that she was one of those people whose sense of purpose is attached to a specific place rather than a general ambition. The Valley was not a stepping stone. It was the thing itself. And there was something clarifying, she'd come to understand, about choosing the thing itself rather than waiting to see what better thing might come along. She had planned, once, a practical life in Clearwater with a man of steady habits and fair dealing. She did not regret the blizzard that had taken it from her, because she was not the same person who had planned it, and she could see clearly that the life she had built in Bloodstone Valley, the one she had not planned and could not have predicted, fit the person she actually was in a way the Clearwater life never would have. This was not a comfortable thought, because it meant that the hardest year of her life had also been the most useful one, and that was not a trade she'd have agreed to in advance. She wouldn't have agreed to it, and it was the best thing that had happened to her. She held that contradiction without resolving it, because some true things don't resolve. They just sit there, being true from both directions. The last piece of Consolidated's legal aftermath cleared in the Valley's 6th year, when the court finalized the restitution distribution and closed the case. Gideon received compensation for the fire on the Eastern Ridge. Not enough to cover what had been lost, but a documented acknowledgement of what had been done, which was, in its own way, the part that mattered more. He built a shelf for the blue glass bottle that had been his wife's in the kitchen of the house on the Eastern Ridge. Not where she would have put it, he didn't try to reconstruct what had been. He put it in the window above the washstand, where it caught the morning light and threw small blue shadows on the wall, and that was where it stayed. Evelyn put her father's compass on the shelf beside it. They were, she thought, two objects with no practical function and a great deal of weight, which seemed like the right things to keep. On an evening in the Valley's 7th year, she sat at her desk in the office above the assay building with the accounts of the cooperative spread in front of her, and the south window open to the summer air, and she looked at the numbers. They were good numbers. They were numbers that told the story of a community that had found a direction and was moving in it, not perfectly, not without the occasional argument and the occasional setback and the occasional family that moved on for reasons no one could argue with, but consistently. Year over year, the direction was the same. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this valley with a broken-latched carpet bag and $43 and a future waiting somewhere else, and she understood something she hadn't understood then. That a person's real life is almost never the one they planned. It's the one they show up for when the plan falls through. The storm had taken everything she'd arranged. What she'd built in its place was not a replacement for what she'd lost. It was something entirely different, with its own weight and its own shape, and it was more hers than anything the plan had offered. She heard Gideon come in below, the particular sound of the building's door and his footsteps on the stairs, which she knew the way. You know the sounds of a place you've lived long enough to stop noticing them, and then one day notice again. "Meeting run late?" she said, without turning from the window. Henderson's still arguing about the East Pasture survey. He appeared in the office doorway with his hat in his hand and dust from the Ridge Road on his coat, and the look of a man who has been listening to an argument about property lines for 3 hours and is philosophical about it. He'll come around. He always comes around. He needs to feel like he arrived there himself. That's most people. He looked at the accounts spread on her desk. "Good?" "Good," she said. "Better than last year." "Better than last year's better than last year?" "Yes." He came and looked over her shoulder at the numbers, which he understood adequately but had no gift for the way she did, and the comfortable reality of it. Two people looking at the same thing from their different angles settled in the room around them. Outside the south window, Bloodstone Valley was doing what it did in the summer evenings. The smoke from supper fires rising from the chimneys, the sound of the Donahue children somewhere on the main street, the school bell that the teacher rang at 5 o'clock for reasons that had nothing to do with school hours and everything to do with the pleasure of having a bell to ring. The mountains around the valley were the color of old bronze in the late light, permanent and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't need anything from you. She had arrived in this valley as a wrong stop, a detour, an accident of weather. She had stayed as a choice. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of life that didn't announce itself or resolve neatly at the end of anything, because it was still going, still being built, still imperfect, still full of Henderson arguing about pasture surveys, and the East Road needing attention before mud season, and the school teacher wanting a second room added, and the cooperative's winter coal contract coming up for renegotiation. Still here. She closed the accounts. She put the compass in her pocket. She stood up and turned off the lamp, and she and Gideon went downstairs together into the valley evening, which was warm and ordinary and entirely, completely theirs.